Picture a warehouse the size of a church, every inch of it draped in black. Not decorative black, not fashionable black. Black the way a collapsed mineshaft is black. Black the way a closed coffin lid is black. The walls are black. The ceiling is black. The bolts of fabric stacked floor to rafters are black. Every one of them. Thousands of yards of it, rolled and wrapped and waiting. The mannequins wear black. The assistants wear black. The carpet is black, worn thin from years of shuffling feet. And if you look closely at the edges where the carpet meets the skirting board, you can see it's not actually black at all, but a deep, exhausted burgundy that simply gave up some time in the 1850s and never recovered. There is a smell in this building that you will never fully shake from your clothes. It's the smell of logwood dye and something faintly chemical underneath it, and underneath that, just barely, if you catch it on a warm afternoon when the windows are shut and the irons have been running all day, something that isn't quite death, but is close enough to make you think of it. Add in 100 women bent over their work in a room lit by gas lamps even at noon because the windows have been blacked out, because natural light might fade the merchandise. Add the sound of scissors cutting crepe, which is nothing like the sound of scissors cutting anything else. A muffled, dragging rip rather than a clean snick, because crepe doesn't want to be cut. It wants to cling and fray and catch on every rough edge of your thumbnail. Add the flat irons hissing on their stands, heated on small braziers, and the instruction you were given your very first day that you never, under any circumstances, press a hot iron directly to crepe because it will crinkle and pucker, and then you will owe the cost of a yard of fabric out of your wages, and a yard of good crepe costs more than you earn in a day. That is Jay's Morning Warehouse, 247 Regent Street, London, in the year 1865. The grandest emporium of grief in the known world. A place where the quality of your sorrow can be measured in yards of fabric, and the depth of your loss expressed through the precise ratio of crepe to bombazine trimming on your bonnet brim. A place where, if someone you loved died, you had better show up with money, because grief without proper dress is not grief at all. It is disrespect. It is scandal. It is a thing people will whisper about for years. We're going back there tonight, not to browse the morning department of some genteel shopping emporium with our parasols and our pocket money. We're living it. One season, one person, one trade. Everything she would have smelled and touched and feared and understood in her bones without ever putting it into words. I make these history episodes about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and if you're listening to this at 2 a.m. in the dark with your blanket pulled up to your chin, then honestly, you and this woman would have understood each other perfectly. She spent her working life in permanent twilight, surrounded by black fabric, stitching grief into shapes that other people wore. She knew what it was to work until her fingers bled and then keep working. She knew what it was to be invisible in a room full of sorrow that didn't belong to her. So, get comfortable. Here we go. The knock comes before 4 a.m. Not a polite knock, not a hesitant, apologetic tap. A rapid, flat-palmed knock that rattles the thin door on its hinges and pulls you up out of sleep so fast that for half a second you're sitting upright in the dark with your heart slamming before you've even registered that you're awake. The smell hits you first. Always the smell. The particular dense blackness of this attic room, which is not just darkness but a smell. The accumulated dye and crepe dust and tallow candle smoke of 8 months, living above a morning warehouse. It's in your hair, it's in the blanket. You stopped noticing it after the first week, but it's always there. and in the first shocked moment of waking before your brain catches up, it announces itself fully, chemical, dusty, faintly sweet in a way that isn't sweet at all. Agnes, Mrs. Fenn's voice through the door. Your mistress, the woman who runs the fitting rooms at Jay's, who has never in living memory knocked on anyone's door before sunrise, which means only one thing. Someone important has died. Agnes, get up. Telegram came. You swing your feet to the floor. The boards are cold enough to be a punishment, cold enough that your feet flinch from them before pressing down. The candle on your narrow table has burned out hours ago, and the room is absolute dark except for the faint orange line under the door from Mrs. Fenn's lamp. Coming. Your voice comes out thick with sleep. You find your stockings by touch, pulling them on in the dark. Your dress is on the hook by the window, and you know this because you put it there every single night, because Mrs. Fenn told you on your first day that a girl who cannot find her clothes in the dark is a girl who will cost this establishment time, and time is money, and money is what keeps food on all of your plates, which is the longest sentence she has ever strung together in your presence, and you committed it to memory immediately. You open the door. Mrs. Fenn stands in the narrow corridor with a lamp in one hand and a folded paper in the other. She's already fully dressed. You have never, not once in 8 months, seen Mrs. Fenn in any state that could be called undressed. She exists in a state of permanent readiness, as though grief might call at any hour, which of course it can, which of course it does, which is exactly why you're standing here barefoot at 4 a.m, rubbing sleep out of your eyes. She holds out the telegram. You read it. The Earl of Whitbourne died yesterday evening. His wife, the Countess, requires complete deep mourning dress for herself and her 2 daughters by 2 o'clock this afternoon. A carriage will be sent at 9. Payment is not a concern. You look up from the paper. 10 hours, you say. 9.5, Mrs. Fenn says. Get dressed properly. Eat something if there's anything left in the kitchen. I need you in the cutting room in 20 minutes. She turns and walks away down the corridor without waiting for your answer, her lamp throwing a moving orange oval across the walls, and you stand for a moment in the doorframe looking at the telegram again. Complete deep mourning. 3 women, 9.5 hours. You have done this before. You have done this in worse conditions. You once helped dress an entire family of 6 for a baronet's funeral in 6 hours, because the baronet had the inconsideration to die on a Thursday afternoon when half the workroom had already gone home. You know the mechanics of it. You know where every bolt of fabric is stored and which seamstresses are fastest, and how to make crepe behave when it doesn't want to. But complete deep mourning for a countess is not the same as deep mourning for a baronet's family. Not at this house, not at Jay's. Everything has to be right. You go back into the dark room, sit on the edge of your bed, and start to button your dress. Your fingers find the buttons by feel. The small horn buttons, cool and smooth, each one requiring a small precise movement of thumbnail and forefinger that your hands now do without thought. 8 months ago your fingers fumbled over buttons. 8 months ago you fumbled over everything. Now your hands move like a separate intelligence, competent and fast, while your mind is already in the cutting room calculating yardages. The Countess herself. Full mourning. That means bombazine for the dress, silk for the cape, crepe trim on everything, crepe on the bonnet, crepe on the veil, black gloves, black handkerchiefs, black jet brooch if she doesn't already own one, the widow's cap in white lawn, and here you must be careful, because the white against all that black must be exactly right, the proportions correct, the frilling precise. A widow who is dressed wrong attracts comment. At this level of society, comment is catastrophic. The daughters. Deep mourning, but not widow's mourning. Different rules. No widow's cap, obviously. Crepe trim, but not crepe dominant. Black ribbon at collar and cuffs. Black gloves. Bonnet suitably sombre. You stand up, pull your hair back, pin it with 4 pins that you keep stuck into the wooden frame of the little mirror above the washstand. The mirror shows you only a shape in the dark, a pale oval face above a dark dress. You look like someone who works with grief for a living. You go downstairs. The cutting room is in the basement, accessed by a door at the back of the building that opens onto a steep staircase smelling of coal and damp stone. You descend carefully, one hand on the wall, because the lamp at the bottom of the stairs is lit, but only just. A thin, wavering thread of light that suggests rather than reveals the steps. Mrs. Fenn is already there. So is Ellen Marsh, no relation despite the name, who is the fastest seamstress in the building, and who has the slightly fixed, forward-looking expression of a person who has decided to be entirely awake before the evidence fully supports it. And so is Mr. Croft, who manages the fabric stores and who is currently pulling down bolts of black bombazine from the upper shelves with a long-handled hook, setting them on the cutting table one by one with soft, heavy thumps. The room is cold. The gas jet on the wall gives out a thin blue-white light that shows everything in unflattering precision. Your breath fogs slightly. The fabric on the cutting table is slightly cool to the touch, which you notice because your first instinct on entering a cutting room is always to touch the fabric, to run your fingertips across the surface and take its measure, the way a doctor takes a pulse. Bombazine, a heavy wool and silk twill, dull finished, with a weight and density that makes even a small bolt require both arms to lift. It drapes beautifully, which is why it is the fabric of serious mourning, deep mourning, the kind that announces to the world that your grief is real and total and has not yet been adjusted for social convenience. It also holds shape through months of daily wearing, which matters when you're expected to be in full mourning for 2 years and 3 months. 2 years and 3 months for a husband. That is the rule. Has been the rule for decades. Will be the rule for decades more. A widow who returns to half mourning before the prescribed period invites scandal. A widow who is seen in colour before 2 years and 3 months have passed does not merely commit a fashion error. She communicates to the world something about her grief, about her character, about how much, truly, she valued the man she lost. Whether she loved him or not is entirely beside the point. The fabric communicates what matters. You take off your jacket and put on your apron. Black, of course. Everyone in this building wears black. It's practical. Black dye goes everywhere, and if your dress is already black, you cannot ruin it. It's also, Mrs. Fisson has said, with no apparent sense of irony, appropriate to the atmosphere of the establishment. Bolt 37 for the bodice panels, Mrs. Fenn says, without looking up from her paper, and get the crepe from the upper store. We need 12 yards for the Countess and 6 each for the daughters. The crepe's just been delivered from Courtaulds, Mr. Croft says. Saturday's shipment, still in the wrapping paper. This is good news. Freshly delivered crepe from Courtaulds Mill in Essex is the best available. Courtaulds makes nearly all the mourning crepe sold in England. The mill sits in the town of Braintree, employing hundreds of women and girls to make the particular crimped gauze that has become the symbol, the absolute primary symbol, of Victorian grief. You were from Essex, not Braintree. A village called Hatfield Broad Oak, 12 miles from the Courtauld Mill. Your mother had a distant cousin who worked there. When you were a child, you thought of crepe as simply the fabric that came from the town nearby, the fabric that appeared in your village on the women who had lost someone, the black that spread through a community like a slow stain after a death. You did not think of it as your future trade. You did not think of it as something that would define the particular texture of your working life, the permanent slight roughness of your fingertips, the black line along your nail bed that never quite washes out. You go to the upper store for the crepe. The upper store is a long, low room above the main cutting room, accessed by a ladder that you have climbed probably 400 times since you arrived at Jay's. It smells different from the rest of the building. Less dye, more raw fabric. The cold in here is dry and close. Your lamp throws shadows between the shelves that loom on either side, packed with bolts of black in every weight and weave. You find the fresh court-oiled crepe near the door, still in its wrapper, the brown paper tied with string. You pick up the first bolt and hold it for a moment. It is lighter than it looks. This is the paradox of crepe. It is everywhere in deep mourning, covering the skirt and trimming the bonnet and cascading from the veil, yards and yards of it, and yet it weighs almost nothing. A full deep mourning outfit for a wealthy widow might contain 15 yards of crepe and still weigh less than the bombazine underskirt. The weight is psychological, not physical. You carry 2 bolts down the ladder, making 2 trips, careful on the rungs, the second bolt tucked under your arm with the practiced ease of someone who has carried bolts up and down this ladder since October. Then you go back for more. By the time you return to the cutting room, Mrs. Fenn has her paper laid out and is marking measurements in her precise, close handwriting. Ellen has her scissors ready. Mr. Croft is heating the first of the flat irons on its brazier. The Countess was measured here 3 years ago, Mrs. Fenn says. We have her form. Alterations for any recent change in figure will be done at the fitting this morning. She pauses. She's 38. She's been confined twice since her last visit. Allow accordingly at the waist. You nod. You write this down in your own small notebook, the one you carry in your apron pocket. Mrs. Fenn has the form, but you need the numbers yourself so that your hands can begin the calculations independently. The constant invisible arithmetic of dressmaking. If the waist is this, the seam allowance is that. The bodice dart falls here, the skirt drop begins there. The daughters, Mrs. Fenn continues, 14 and 11. We have no forms for them. The 11-year-old may be difficult. Children of that age resist standing still. Ellen snorts, which is as close as she ever gets to actual laughter. Right, Mrs. Fenn says, which is her entire response to Ellen's snort, which is also her entire response to almost everything. We start cutting at 4:30. I need the crepe measured and the bombazine laid by 5. Agnes, you're on the crepe. Ellen, the bodice panels. Mr. Croft, please heat 2 more irons. You pull the first bolt of crepe to the cutting surface. This is where it starts to matter that you have learned, in 8 months, to treat crepe as an adversary. Crepe is made by twisting silk threads under heat before weaving them, which creates the crimped, grainy texture that is crepe's identifying characteristic. That particular rough but soft surface, like a very fine pumice stone, like something that is almost textured enough to catch the light but refuses to. The crimp is what makes it mourn properly. It absorbs light instead of reflecting it. It lies flat against colour and makes the colour disappear. It is the anti-silk, the deliberate negation of everything that makes fashionable fabric beautiful. It is also, in practical terms, a nightmare. The crimp means that crepe shifts under the scissors if you are not precise. It frays if you breathe on it wrong. It stains immediately and permanently if it gets wet. Rain, tears, even a splash from washing your hands while wearing it will leave a pale grey mark that cannot be removed and cannot be hidden, and will require the entire ruined piece to be replaced. Victorian widows were sometimes seen holding their skirts almost above their knees to keep the crepe clear of puddles, which gave the newspapers things to say about the dignity of grief. It also smells, not badly exactly, but distinctly. The crimping process and the subsequent dyeing with logwood give crepe a particular smell. Dusty, slightly astringent, with a very faint chemical undertone that catches at the back of your throat on close days. After 8 months of working with it daily, you notice the smell only when you're away from it and then return. Like the smell of your own house after you've been away a week. You unroll the first bolt flat across the cutting table and smooth it with your palms. Your hands drag very slightly on the surface, the characteristic friction of crepe against skin, neither smooth nor rough, but something between the two that is uniquely itself. You feel the tiny ridges of the crimp under your fingertips as you measure, the measuring cord. You lay it along the fabric's edge, count in yards, mark with a thread of white silk tucked into the weave so lightly it won't leave a hole. 3 yards for the hem trim, 2 yards for the sleeve ruffles, 1.5 for the collar and cuffs, 1/2 yard for the bonnet brim. And the veil. The widow's veil is the most significant piece, the most visible, the thing that says widow to every person on every street the Countess walks down for the next 2 years and 3 months. The veil needs to be right. You take a separate bolt, a longer one, and run your measuring cord along it carefully. The veil will hang from the back of the widow's cap and fall to at least mid-back. On a woman of the Countess's height, which Mrs. Fenn's form gives you as 5 feet and 3 inches, you need 2.25 yards for proper length. It must hang without pulling. It must move correctly when she walks, which is to say it must move with her, a shadow that follows a half second behind. A veil that pulls at the cap pins announces itself as something that was hurried, something that was made without care, and that announcement lands hardest on the day of the funeral, in the church, in front of everyone when everyone is watching. You cut with both hands on the scissors, right hand providing pressure, left hand guiding, the blades moving through the crepe in that characteristic muffled drag. The sound the fabric makes when it yields to the cut is unlike anything else. It is almost silent, a sort of soft giving. Across the table, Ellen is cutting bombazine. Bombazine sounds completely different. A dense, decisive snick that says this fabric knows what it is and accepts it. Bombazine doesn't fray and doesn't shift. It goes where you tell it. You have always thought, privately, that bombazine is the more honest fabric. Crepe is theatrical. Crepe performs grief. Bombazine simply wears it. Agnes, Mrs. Fenn says from the other side of the room. The veil. Do we have the double weight? From Courtaud's new delivery. Yes. Use it. The Countess won't want to be seen through. Of course not. The double-weight crepe veil is what separates the serious widow from the widow who is merely correct. The lightweight veil through which a face is visible says, I am in mourning. The double-weight veil through which only a pale oval registers says, I am destroyed. My face is no longer a public matter. My grief has removed me from the world of ordinary looking. Queen Victoria wears the double weight. has worn it every day since Prince Albert died in December of 1861, 4 years ago now, has made it, through the sheer volume of her continuing presence, the only acceptable choice for any widow of any standing. The Queen is in mourning and intends to remain so, and the rest of the country has adjusted its expectations accordingly. You take the double-weight veil bolt and begin measuring. 4 a.m, the gas jet hisses. The iron sits on its stand, sending up a thread of heat you can see in the cold air, a slight shimmer above the brazier. Ellen's scissors snick through bombazine in a steady rhythm. Mr. Croft moves between the shelves and the cutting table, silent as always. Your own scissors drag through crepe. Outside, Regent Street is empty. You know this without looking because you have been here 8 months, and you know what every hour of this street sounds like, and at 4 a.m. it sounds like nothing, like a city pausing to breathe, like the 3-hour gap between the night's last revellers going home and the morning's first cart horses starting up. In 6 hours, the street will be alive again. The carriages will come, and the ladies will come, and the grief will come in through the front door with its gloves folded, and its veil pinned, and its need to be dressed for the worst thing that has ever happened to it. But right now there is just this. 4 people in a basement, cutting black fabric in the cold, because someone died. You have to understand what mourning dress is really, in this time as in this city, if you want to understand why it matters that the crepe is right and the veil is double weight and the bombazine falls correctly at the hem. It is not vanity. Or it is not only vanity the way a church is not only architecture. Mourning dress is a language. The most important social language a Victorian woman has access to at certain moments of her life. It tells everyone who sees her, instantly and without ambiguity, that she has suffered a specific loss of a specific degree of proximity, that she is at a specific stage in the socially prescribed period of grief, and that she is observing her obligations to the dead and to the living with appropriate seriousness. A widow in correct full mourning is a woman who cannot be criticized. Her dress protects her. It closes around her like armour. As long as the crepe is right and the veil is correct and no colour shows at her throat or wrists, she is above reproach. Her grief is visible and it is proper, and it makes certain demands on the people around her. Speak to her gently. Make allowances for her silence. Do not press her on matters of business. Do not expect her to be entertaining. A widow in incorrect mourning is something else entirely. A widow who returns to half mourning before her time, who is seen in grey or lavender before 18 months have passed, who wears good silk instead of bombazine or jet buttons instead of black glass. That widow has communicated something. The world will decide what, and the world will not be generous. You know women who have ruined themselves this way, not ruined in the dramatic sense of novels, ruined in the quieter sense of the drawing room, of the calling card returned, of the pew at church that empties slightly when she enters, of the way a hostess's face shifts almost imperceptibly when her name comes up in planning a dinner. It sounds small. It is not small. This is the entirety of a certain kind of woman's life, these rooms and these visits, and these careful small negotiations of social standing. To lose ground here is to lose everything, and the women who came to Jay's came because they understood this. They came because grief had stripped them of almost everything, sometimes their income, sometimes their home, always their status as a wife and a woman with a husband's name and protection. And what remained, what they could still control, was the black silk at their throats and the proper weight of the crepe on their bonnets. This is what you are making in this cold basement at 4 in the morning. This is what the scissors are cutting. Not just fabric, something harder to name and more necessary. You've been at this for 2 hours before the workroom begins to fill. The other seamstresses arrive in 2s and 3s, shaking cold off their coats, pinning on their aprons. You know them all by now. Mary Hayward, who is the fastest with a needle, but whose stitches sometimes show on close inspection, which means she works on linings. Sarah Pugh, who has the best eye for crepe trim and who can look at a bonnet and tell you in 30 seconds exactly what it needs. Old Mrs. Bellingham, who's been here longer than anyone, and who does the alterations with the kind of steady certainty that comes from 30 years of the same work, and a handful of others, younger women like you, who fill in where needed, who learn from the more experienced, who earn their small wages and sleep in the attics and learn to find their dresses in the dark. They come in, they read the morning's order pinned to the board, and they get to work. There is no greeting beyond a nod. This is normal. This is how it is here. The pace sets itself. You're on the crepe trim, and you do not stop moving. The particulars of crepe trim, if you've never had occasion to know them, are as follows. Crepe is attached to bombazine not by machine but by hand, using a very fine running stitch, close and even, in black silk thread. The machine stitching pulls the crepe, distorts the crimp, creates a puckered line that shows against the dull surface of the fabric like a scar. Hand stitching, done correctly, lies flat and invisible. To do it correctly requires holding the needle at precisely the right angle and drawing the thread through at precisely the right tension. Too tight and the fabric draws. Too loose and the trim will catch on things and pull. Your fingers do this now without thinking, or rather your fingers think about it so that your mind does not have to. Your mind can move forward, measuring the morning, calculating what remains to be done, while your hands do the work that keeps the establishment running. Stitch, draw, stitch, draw. The thread is thin enough that you occasionally lose it against the black fabric and have to find it again by feel. This happens less than it used to. 8 months ago it happened constantly, and Mrs. Fenn would appear behind you with that particular quality of silence that meant she was watching and you were not fast enough. Stitch. Draw. The crepe lies flat under your left thumb. The right hand pulls the needle through and back. The room fills with the sound of work. Threads pulling, scissors cutting, the occasional hiss of an iron against bombazine that wants pressing. The smell of the irons is particular, not the iron itself. The steam that rises from black bombazine when pressed releases something from the dye, a faint acrid thread in the warm air, logwood and iron salt, and something undefinable underneath. You're so used to this smell that you notice it mostly when it intensifies, when someone is pressing a particularly large piece, and the whole room briefly tastes of it. At 6:30 someone brings down a tray from the kitchen. Bread and cold meat and tea, which is the same as every morning, which is adequate, which is more than adequate compared to what you had in Hatfield Broad Oak. You eat standing up, because sitting down at work is not a habit encouraged at Jay's, and Mrs. Fenn is never entirely absent even when she's physically in another room. The tea is strong and very hot. You drink it fast, burning your tongue slightly, which you don't notice properly until half an hour later, when everything you swallow feels slightly raw. By 7, the bodice panels for the Countess's dress are cut and basted, and Sarah Pugh is fitting them together on the mannequin that most closely approximates the measurements from the Countess's form. You watch for a moment while you thread a new needle. because the construction of a well-made mourning bodice is one of those things that rewards watching. The way the seams pull the fabric in, and the shape emerges from flat pieces of cloth, like something that was always there, waiting to be found. It will not be finished by the time the carriage comes at 9. It cannot be. A bodice that is properly boned and lined and finished takes more time than 9 hours. What will be ready is a carefully constructed first-fitting piece that will be adjusted on the Countess's actual body, taken apart in the parts that require adjustment, and reconstructed by the team working at the house for the rest of the day. 2 of the senior seamstresses will go in the carriage. You will be one of them. Mrs. Fenn told you this at 5 o'clock with the same tone she uses for everything, which is the tone of a fact being stated rather than a choice being offered. You are both honoured and terrified. You've been to 2 house fittings before, both for families of moderate prominence, both straightforward. This is a countess. This is full deep mourning for a titled family on a deadline, in a house where every servant will be watching, and the grief will be real and immediate and present in every room. You thread the needle, you go back to the crepe trim, stitch, draw, stitch, draw. Here is what you understand about grief, which is something you understand differently now than you did when you arrived at Jay's. You came from a place where death was ordinary in the way that weather is ordinary, expected, regular, handled with the resources available and not much more. When someone died in Hatfield Broad Oak, the women of the family stitched what black they had or borrowed it from a neighbour, and the body lay in the front room for 2 days, and then it went to the churchyard, and then the women wore the black for as long as they could keep it clean, which was not 2 years and 3 months, which was as long as they could manage and not much longer, because black fabric and mourning clothes were expensive, and most people had one good dress to their name, and couldn't afford to keep it black indefinitely when black made every speck of lint visible and required constant laundering. Grief in Hatfield Broad Oak was felt in the body and expressed in the face and lasting in the memory and not especially visible in the clothes after the first 3 months. Grief at Jay's was something else. The women who came through the front door of this establishment had grief that had been assigned a duration and a wardrobe. Their mourning was not a response to loss, but a schedule. A 2-year and 3-month programme of graduated withdrawal from full black bombazine crepe-covered first morning to black silk, second morning to the gentle grey and lavender and white of half morning, and finally the cautious return to colour. All of it prescribed, all of it watched, all of it documented in the pages of Sylvia's home journal and the Young Englishwoman and a dozen other publications that ran regular columns on the proprieties of mourning dress, with the same seriousness that they ran columns on sanitation and cookery. Was the grief felt in the body here? Yes, of course. You have seen enough of it coming through that door. The red-rimmed eyes, the hands that shake when they open the purse, the daughters who stand too close to their mothers, the mothers who stand too straight, who have already begun the work of holding themselves together in a way that will leave them exhausted by nightfall. But the grief here was also a performance, was also a social obligation, was also, in ways that the women themselves might not have named but certainly felt, a kind of protection. While you are correctly dressed, no one can harm you further. While the black is right, and the crepe is right, and the veil is correct weight and correct length, you have met your obligations, and the world must give you your season of darkness and not ask more of you. This is what Jay's sold. Not just fabric, not just dresses. The protection of correct grieving, the armour of visible sorrow. At 8 o'clock, Mrs. Fenn calls you and Sarah Pugh to her office, which is a small room off the main workroom that smells of rosewater and ledger paper and the particular cold iron smell of a woman who has been at work since before dawn. She has laid out the pieces for the house fitting, the basted bodice, the cut but unstitched skirt panels, the veil still on its bolt, the widow's cap in its preliminary form, the trimming measurements on paper. The Countess will be in shock, she says. Not performance shock, real shock. Her husband died yesterday evening, and she has children and a household, and there will be matters of business pressing on her before the body is cold. Mrs. Fenn's voice has no sentimentality in it, which is not cruelty, you have come to understand, but rather the practical orientation of a woman who has been in the presence of real grief for 30 years, and has learned that grief does not need to be narrated to be honoured. You will not comment on anything you see in that house. You will not express condolences beyond what is necessary at first greeting. You will measure what needs measuring. You will pin what needs pinning, and you will be quick about all of it. The house will be full of people who have their own business there, and the last thing they need is a fitting room performance. Sarah nods. You nod. The daughters. Mrs. Fenn pauses. She picks up her pen and sets it down again. The elder girl is 14. She lost her father last night. She's 14 years old, and she lost her father last night, and she will be required to stand still while strangers measure her for mourning clothes. Another pause. Be gentle with that one. You've written nothing down. You don't need to. You won't forget. Agnes. Mrs. Fenn's eyes move to you. They are dark grey eyes that miss nothing. I am sending you because you are quick, and because you are careful, and because in 8 months I have not had to unpick your crepe trim. A pause. That is, you believe the closest Mrs. Fenn comes to a compliment. Don't give me reason to regret it. No, ma'am. Good. The carriage is due at 9. Be at the front by 5:02. The carriage that comes at 9 is not what you expected, though on reflection you're not certain what you expected. A large black brougham, the horses already in their black rosette bridles because the household is in mourning, and the horses' harnesses must reflect this because yes, the horses must mourn correctly. The coachman is in black, the footman is in black. You climb in with Sarah and the bags of fabric and equipment, and the door is closed behind you, and the carriage moves off down Regent Street, north to south, into the thickening morning. You're in Mayfair in 12 minutes. The streets through the carriage window are London getting on with itself. A dray horse labouring over the cobbles with a load of coal, a woman in a green coat stepping out of a baker's with a paper-wrapped loaf, a crossing sweeper clearing a path through the mud and horse droppings at the intersection of 2 streets. The morning sky is the particular whitish grey of a November London sky, not threatening rain exactly, but not offering anything better. Gas lamps are still lit on some streets, though it is full daylight. Coal smoke sits in a thin haze above the rooftops. Sarah sits across from you, her hands in her lap, looking out the window. Sarah has been at Jay's for 6 years. She is 24 and from Stepney, and she has the quality of someone who has seen enough of the world to find it more interesting than alarming. She catches you watching her and gives you a look that is both reassurance and instruction. Be calm, be professional, be quiet, do the work. You look back out the window. The house is in Grosvenor Square. Of course it is. Of course it's in Grosvenor Square, which is one of the most expensive addresses in England, which is where the aristocracy keeps itself in London, in the tall windowed terrace houses with their white stucco and their brass knockers, and their servants visible only as shadows moving behind glass. Number 17, Grosvenor Square. There is black on the door. A large square of black crepe has been pinned there, which is tradition. A house in mourning announces itself to the street. The knocker has been wrapped in black ribbon. The curtains are drawn on the upper floors. 2 men stand at the door in black and in the particular posture of professionally maintained gravity. The mutes, hired to stand here and there and look like grief made visible. You have seen mutes before, obviously. You have outfitted them. There are brief trade in mourning dress for mutes at Jay's. The black coat, the black gloves, the black crepe-wrapped staff that a mute carries when accompanying a funeral procession. It is a strange occupation to contemplate. Your entire job is to stand near a door and look sad. Not to speak, not to interact, simply to embody, by your presence and your expression and your carefully correct black clothing, the fact that this house has suffered a loss. They look at you as you step out of the carriage, not with interest or suspicion, more as though your presence is being registered by something slightly more sophisticated than furniture. You follow Sarah to the door. The footman who opens it is young and composed, and has obviously been awake since the night before. He has the tightened eyes and slightly over-controlled movement of someone running on will and habit with the fuel used up. He takes your card, Sarah's card, the Jay's card, and leads you through the hallway. You've been in fine houses before, both in your time at Jay's and before that in Hatfield Broad Oak, where the local great house was Georgian and draughty and smelled of dogs and wet stone. This hallway is different in every particular. The floor is black and white marble, already cold enough through the soles of your boots to register as significant. The staircase rises in a wide sweep to the upper floors. The walls are hung with portraits in heavy gilt frames, men in military dress, women in silk, children with the slightly glassy expression of portrait subjects who have been made to sit still longer than is natural for children. The black has already begun to arrive here too. The normal life of the house has been suspended and replaced with another kind of life, quieter, more deliberate, conducted in lower voices. A maid passes along the upstairs landing carrying a pile of dark fabric. Somewhere above you, a door opens and closes. Somewhere further still, muffled, there is the sound of a woman crying. Not the Countess. Something in the sound is too young for the Countess. The older daughter, maybe. 14 years old, and her father died last night, and she is somewhere in this house crying, and in a few minutes you're going to ask her to stand still while you measure her for mourning dress. You follow the footman. The Countess receives you in the morning room, which has had its curtains drawn and its ornaments removed and a black cloth laid over the mantelpiece. These small ritual alterations of a room in mourning, the covered mirrors, the draped clocks, the drawn curtains, a houseware's mourning too in its way. The Countess is standing by the window, looking out through a narrow gap in the curtain at the square below. She's wearing, you assess this immediately, professionally, a black day dress that was clearly already in her wardrobe and was never intended as mourning wear. The fabric is black wool, but it has a faint lustre that mourning fabric must not have, and the cuffs show a white trim that should not be there, and the hem is not long enough, and there is no crepe anywhere. She is dressed in the first black thing she could put on, which is exactly what you would do, what anyone would do, if their husband died the night before and a carriage full of dressmakers was arriving in the morning. She turns when you enter. The Countess of Whitbourne is 38 years old and has the kind of face that is currently doing the thing faces do when they have had a very large feeling that they have decided not to show to strangers. Her eyes are controlled. Her hands are controlled. But there is a quality to her stillness that is not peace, but is instead the active, continuous effort of a woman who has decided to remain standing and intends to keep deciding this. Mrs. Fenn's women, she says, not a question. Yes, my lady, I am Sarah Pugh, and this is Agnes Marsh. We're very sorry for your loss. Thank you. Crisp. Brief. Moving past it immediately because dwelling on it is what the crying upstairs is for, and this room is for the practical matter of clothing a countess in grief. What do you need from me? This is the nature of the transaction, you understand. She needs to be dressed, and you need to dress her, and both of you will hold the actual weight of the thing at arm's length while the measuring tape and the pins do their work, because that is how this gets done. Sarah sets her bag down. You open yours. The fabric pieces come out. The widow's cap in its paper wrapping. The veil on its small board. Sarah takes out the measuring tape. If you'll allow me, my lady. The Countess stands straight and extends her arms slightly. The posture of a woman who has been measured many times in her life, who knows how to hold her body for a dressmaker. Her face looks slightly past Sarah's shoulder at the middle distance. Not absent. Present. But carefully so. You prepare the widow's cap. The widow's cap is a small, close-fitting cap of white lawn, trimmed with white and black, with long streamers at the back that will fall beneath the veil. It is the most intimate piece of mourning dress in a way, because it sits directly against the head and must fit precisely. It was the first thing the Countess's predecessor, 200 years ago, would have put on at the news of her husband's death, the first visible marker of her changed state, and here, now, in 1865, it has the same force. The widow's cap says, I am no longer merely a wife, I am a widow. My status has changed. Everything that follows flows from that change. You carry it to the Countess and hold it near her face, gauging the proportion. She is looking at it. She's been controlled until this moment, but something in the sight of the cap, the small, precise white thing with its trailing black streamers, seems to register differently than the measuring tape did. You watch her take a breath and hold it for a second. Then, continue. You pin the cap lightly at the crown, just to see the proportion. Your hands move quickly and gently because they know that this is not a moment for anything other than speed and care. Perfect, Sarah says, assessing. To you, half an inch forward. You adjust. You pin again. The two daughters come in a few minutes later, brought by a governess, who has the expression of someone who's been awake for 12 hours and has already had to manage this morning's most difficult emotional moments, and is now managing this one, which is the practical one, by the application of quiet efficiency. The elder girl is exactly what Mrs. Fenn described. 14. With her father's eyes, you think, though you have never seen the Earl, and so this is perhaps imagination. She has been crying. Her face shows it. But she is no longer crying now. She's standing slightly apart from her mother, with the particular frozen dignity of a girl who has decided that she will not cry in front of strangers, which is a decision that requires her to hold herself extremely still. You feel something for her. You tuck it down and keep your hands moving. The younger one is 11 and has not yet decided how to be in this situation, which means she's not frozen but uncertain, looking from her mother to the dressmakers and back, as though waiting for someone to tell her the correct response. When Sarah kneels down to her height with the measuring tape, the girl flinches slightly, then steadies. You measure the older girl. You write the numbers. You do not comment on anything in the room. You do not look at the girl's face longer than you need to. You do everything you can to make your presence as minimally intrusive as possible, which is its own kind of courtesy, one that nobody will thank you for, and that matters regardless. Half an hour. That is all it takes. Measurements, fittings, adjustments, decisions about the specific pieces. Mrs. Fenn's preliminary work was good and the adjustments are small. The Countess is precise about what she wants, which makes the work easier. More crepe on the mantle, less on the bonnet brim, the veil at maximum length. The veil at maximum length. You say nothing about this. It is her choice. It is her grief. It is her marriage that ended last night, and her household that has changed shape, and her daughters who are standing in this room wearing the wrong clothes while you pin black fabric to their shoulders. The maximum length veil will require an additional 3/4 of a yard. You write this in your notebook. You are back in the carriage by 10:30. Sarah is already calculating yardage. Her fingers move against her knee as though counting stitches in the air. You sit with your notebook open, your pencil working, making the notes that will translate into orders for the workroom. The streets of Mayfair pass the windows. A woman in full mourning walks along the pavement, her double-weight veil over her face, the long black of her dress trailing slightly behind her on the wet stone. She's not the Countess. She's a stranger, another widow in another grief, making her way along the street with her face invisible. You watch her until the carriage turns and she disappears. First time at a house that size, Sarah says, without looking up from her calculations. More or less. They're all the same, those houses, when someone's died, she pauses. Except the ones where no one's particularly sorry. Those are different. Quieter in a different way. She glances up. This wasn't that. No, you agree. It wasn't. She'll manage. Sarah says it simply, not as comfort but as observation. They always do. The ones with children manage because they don't have the option of not managing. She looks back at her notebook. The elder girl will be the harder one for a while. You say nothing. The carriage makes its way back up toward Regent Street. There are approximately 9 hours of work remaining to be done today, if all goes well, and there's no particular reason to assume all will go well. But the fabric is cut, and the measurements are taken, and the workroom is in motion, and you know how to do this, and the day will go the way it goes. You open your notebook to the new measurements and start counting. This is what the mourning trade looks like from the inside. What it looks like from the outside is rather different. If you stand on Regent Street on any given morning in November 1865 and watch the customers going into Jay's, what you see is this. Women in black, emerging from black-trimmed carriages, entering a building whose interior they know well, whose staff they have visited before, for whom this is not the first grief and will not be the last. They come with their daughters and their sisters and their aunts, because mourning is not an individual matter but a social one, and the acquisition of mourning dress is also oddly a social occasion. A visit to the dressmaker, the fitting, the discussion of crepe weights and bonnet trims conducted over tea in the private fitting rooms. The fitting rooms at Jay's have settees and tea, and the kind of muted, careful atmosphere that acknowledges that the women who come here are not on a pleasant shopping trip, but that the shopping must be done regardless. This is the thing you have come to understand working here. Grief and commerce are not as incompatible as they sound. The women who came to Jay's were not being crass in purchasing their mourning dress. They were doing what the world required of them, which was both a burden and, in its way, a comfort. The purchase of the correct dress was something that could be accomplished. something with a definite outcome. In the midst of the profound formlessness of loss, the fitting room offered specificity. This colour, this weight, this length, this number of months. Something that could be checked off a list. But the list was also a weapon sometimes. Not all women who came to Jay's came because they wanted to. You have seen the ones who came because they had to, and the difference is visible in their eyes. A woman who has lost a beloved husband comes in with grief on her face and a willingness in her hands. She wants the black. The black is hers. It marks what she has lost and protects her in the marking. A woman who has lost an unkind husband, or a distant one, or one she had long since stopped loving, or one she was actively afraid of. That woman comes in and stands for her measurements, with a face that is performing something. The grief is correct. The dress will be correct. The black will be worn for the full period, and the crepe will be heavy and the veil will hang to the proper length. But you have learned, in 8 months, to notice things with your hands that the measuring tape doesn't measure. The way a woman holds her breath while you pin the bodice. The way a woman's shoulders drop when she puts on the widow's cap and sees herself in the glass. The way a woman turns quickly away from her reflection and asks about the quality of the bombazine in a voice that is asking about something else entirely. You don't say anything about these things. There is nothing to say. Mourning dress is mourning dress, and the rules do not distinguish between the widow who is devastated and the widow who is, possibly, almost imperceptibly, somewhere beneath the black and the crepe and the correct grief, the smallest amount relieved. The dress is the same, the weight is the same, the crepe is the same. You measure and you pin and you keep your face professional and your hands precise, and you write the numbers in your notebook. By noon, the workroom is at full capacity, and the noise of it is the noise of concentrated effort. Threads pulling, scissors cutting, the hiss of irons, the rapid low conversation of women consulting one another over a seam or a trim. Mrs. Fenn moves through the room in her quiet, deliberate way, checking, adjusting, saying nothing unless something needs saying, and then saying only exactly what is necessary. You are finishing the crepe trim on the Countess's bodice, when Mary Hayward leans over from the adjacent table and murmurs, almost without moving her lips, which is a skill that the workroom has developed collectively as a response to Mrs. Fenn's views on conversation during working hours. There's a woman at the front asking for rentals. Rentals. Jay's rented morning dress. This was not well advertised, not featured in the windows, not part of the aspirational display of the main floor, but it existed, for the families that needed it, for the people who had suffered a loss and did not have the means to purchase a new black wardrobe, and could not wait for the weeks it might take to get altered second-hand pieces from the mourning houses in the lower-end streets east of here. A rental was a practical mercy. A dress borrowed for the funeral, returned afterward, clean, pressed, returned by evening if possible. No one at the ceremony would know. The dress would be indistinguishable from a purchased one, which was the entire point. Mrs. Fenn handled most rental inquiries herself, but Mrs. Fenn was upstairs consulting with one of the saleswomen about a stock order. You set down your work and go to the front. The woman standing in the small anteroom off the main entrance is perhaps 35, wearing a dark grey dress that is not mourning grey, but rather the dark grey of a dress that has been grey for several years and is now the dark grey of a garment making its best effort. Her hands are folded in front of her. She has the posture of someone who has rehearsed this visit and intends to get through it without anything that could be called distress, which is itself a kind of distress. Her husband, she explains without preamble and without quite meeting your eyes, died 3 days ago. The funeral is tomorrow. She has 4 children. She needs a mourning dress for tomorrow, for herself, and she will return it by evening. She says the last part, the returning it part, with a small tightening around her mouth that says she has thought carefully about the language here and has chosen words that are matter of fact because matter of fact is the only way through this. You ask what size. She tells you. You ask if she has any of the children's measurements. She gives you the older 2 from memory, quickly, as though she's been preparing this too. Wait here, please, you say. You go to the rental room, which is behind the main store, a smaller room with a different smell. Camphor, which is what keeps the stored dress wool from moths, and something faintly stale beneath it, the smell of fabric that has been cleaned and pressed many times and hung waiting in a closed room. The rental pieces are sorted by size and occasion. Full mourning dresses in wool, pressed flat, covered in linen. Children's mourning in smaller sizes. Capes, bonnets, gloves. All clean, all correct, all black. You find her size. You find 2 children's sizes close enough to work with. You carry them out. She looks at the dress when you lay it across the counter. Just looks at it for a moment with an expression you've seen before in the fitting room. The widow confronting the object of her grief made visible. The actual black dress that means the thing has happened. Then she picks it up, feels the fabric, nods. How much? She asks. You tell her it is not expensive. It is calibrated to be affordable because Mrs. Fenn is a practical woman who understands that there is value in a city that knows jays will not leave a widow without a dress for her husband's funeral. The woman opens her purse. She counts out the coins, careful, exact. She takes the dress and the children's pieces folded into brown paper. She thanks you without flourish. She leaves. You stand in the anteroom for a moment after the door closes. This is also the mourning trade. This woman and her grey dress and her exact count of coins, and her 4 children and her husband who died 3 days ago. This is also what the scissors are cutting, what the crepe trim is for. There is no language for the distance between the woman in the grey dress and the countess in Grosvenor Square except money, which is also no language at all. Both women lost a husband. Both women will stand tomorrow before a grave. Both women's grief is real and particular and belongs entirely to them. But one will stand in the correct dress, and one will stand in a rental that fits well enough, and is clean, and is black, and is all that she needs, and all that she can manage, and the world that watches both women will decide, in the quiet, insistent way the world decides these things, which grief was proper. You go back to the workroom. Stitch, draw, stitch, draw. By 3 o'clock the bodice for the Countess is finished, and the skirt panels are assembled, and Sarah Pugh is fitting the crepe veil to the widow's cap with the careful attention of someone who knows that this piece, more than any other, is the one that will be seen first and remembered longest. The cap sits on a stand on Sarah's table, the white lawn foundation with its careful gathering, the cap strings that will tie under the chin, and now the veil being fitted over the back. Sarah pins it and stands back, adjusts, pins again. You watch for a moment, needle paused. The veil at full length, the double-weight crepe, falls from the back of the cap and pulls slightly on the work surface. It absorbs the light in the room. The white of the cap sits at its centre like a small cold star, and the black falls away from it in all directions, dense and matte and total. It is, in its way, a beautiful object. The way something can be beautiful because it is precisely what it is and does precisely what it was made to do. Agnes, Mrs. Fenn's voice from behind you. When you finish that seam, come and look at the bonnet. You finish the seam in 4 minutes. Tie off the thread with a small precise knot. Cut the thread close with your small scissors and go. The bonnet for the Countess is a close-fitting shape in black silk, with a brim that turns slightly forward to shade the face, while still allowing the veil to cascade from the back. The crepe trim on the brim must do a specific thing. It must be wide enough to show clearly as crepe, to announce itself as the mark of deep mourning, without being so wide that it overpowers the bonnet structure or catches in the veil. Mrs. Fenn is holding the bonnet. She gestures at the trim. More depth on the left side. The fold is too flat. You look at the trim. She's right. The fold on the left side has come out slightly compressed, losing the dimensional quality that makes crepe trim read correctly. You take the bonnet, set it on its stand, take your small unpicking tool, and ease 2 stitches free with delicate precision. Reposition. Repin. Mrs. Fenn watches. She doesn't speak while you work. This is one of the things about Mrs. Fenn that you have come to appreciate. She will tell you what needs doing and then trust you to do it, which is a kind of respect even when it feels like silence. Better, she says when you step back. You return the bonnet and go back to your own work. The afternoon passes in this rhythm. The work proceeds. The Countess's morning dress is assembled piece by piece, and the pieces become a whole, as they always do, as they always must. By 5 o'clock the dress is finished and hanging, pressed on its form, and Mrs. Fenn walks around it twice, tugging at the hem, examining the crepe trim at close range, lifting the veil to check the cap position. Then she nods. 1 nod. The whole nod. The nod that means the work is correct. The dress will be delivered at 7 this evening by the senior salesman in the carriage, along with the daughter's pieces and the morning accessories, all wrapped in black tissue and laid in black boxes. The salesman will present the bill, which the Countess's steward will pay, and the boxes will be received by the household's head housemaid, and tomorrow morning the Countess and her daughters will put on what you have made for them, and they will go out into the world correctly dressed for the worst thing that has happened to them. You will probably never see any of them again. This is also the nature of the trade. You sit back in your chair at the cutting table in the minute before Mrs. Fenn notices you are sitting and gives you something else to do, and you let yourself feel the particular tiredness of your hands, the pinching ache at the base of each finger from the hours of fine stitching, the slight rawness across the pads of the fingertips from the crepe surface, the right hand's minor protest at the number of hours it has spent pulling a needle through close-woven black silk thread. Your hands are not beautiful. They have not been beautiful since about your 3rd week at Jay's. The dye has left a permanent grey-black line along the base of your thumbnails that no amount of washing removes. The crepe has raised the calluses at your fingertips into something harder and more pronounced than ordinary seamstress calluses. Your knuckles have the slightly roughened look of hands that work in cold rooms, which this one is. In the winter, which is coming, they will crack at the knuckle joints, and the dye will get in the cracks and stain them. You know this because Mary Hayward's hands look like that in winter. And Mary told you on your first November morning to rub tallow into your knuckles before you sleep, which is not romantic but is practical, which is the kind of advice that Jay's is full of. You look at your hands and you think, these are hands that know something, 8 months of knowing, built into the structure of the palms, the particular way the fingers hold a needle, the automatic angle of the wrist when cutting crepe. Your mother's hands look different from yours. Your mother's hands are farm work hands, broad and strong, calloused at the palm rather than the fingertip. Your grandmother's hands were knitting hands. Your hands are mourning hands. This is what your body is becoming in this city. A particular kind of instrument. Mrs. Fenn appears at the end of the row. When you've rested your eyes, she says with no particular sarcasm, there's a delivery of crepe that needs sorting and the evening rentals to prepare. You stand up. The evening light through the small high windows of the workroom is the grey-orange of a November London dusk, the specific colour that means the day is ending, and the gas lamps are going up. You have been in this building since before 4 this morning. Your feet ache, your hands ache, hands. The particular small muscles behind your shoulder blades ache with the held posture of close sewing. You go to the delivery of crepe. The crepe has come from Courtaulds again, a midweek shipment smaller than Saturday's. You sort it by weight and width, narrow for trim, wide for skirts, double weight for veils. You record the yardage in the stock book. You check for damage, which means running your hands over every bolt and feeling for the slight roughness of a fold that has been set too long, for the damp that will cause mottling, for anything that will translate into a problem when the fabric meets a dress form and a client's exacting expectations. The work of your hands, the steady work. The crepe has its particular smell in this quantity, a whole delivery of it, bolts stacked against the wall, the dusty, chemical sweet smell that is entirely its own, that you will carry home in your hair tonight, that the attic room is full of, that your clothes are full of. It is not an unpleasant smell exactly. It is the smell of your working life, and therefore it is the smell of income and of learning, and of the particular kind of competence that you have spent 8 months building. You record the last bolt and close the stock book. The evening rentals are 3. A dress for a woman whose mother died, a cape for a woman attending her cousin's funeral tomorrow, a bonnet and veil for a woman who has all the rest of her mourning from a previous bereavement, but has mislaid the bonnet and cannot be seen in church without it. You prepare each package with the standard care, pressing where pressing is needed, folding the crepe carefully because a poorly folded veil will come out of its paper with permanent creases that announce themselves in church light. By 7:30 the packages are ready and the delivery boy has taken them. The workroom empties slowly. The other seamstresses go home or up to their rooms, the conversations of the day dropping away as people leave, the noise replacing itself with a particular quality of a workroom after hours. The hiss of the gas jets turned low, the distant street noise from above, the smell of the cooled irons. You sit for a few minutes at your cutting table in the quiet. This is yours, these minutes, not assigned, not belonging to the work, just the still space between the day's end and the evening. You do not always take it. Sometimes you go straight upstairs, but tonight you sit, the work today, the Countess's hands holding the widow's cap, the older daughter's frozen face, the woman in the grey dress and her 4 children and her exact count of coins, all of it real, all of it yours in some way, built into your hands now along with the calluses and the dye stains. You think about what grief looks like from where you sit. You are not a mourner. You have not lost anyone, not recently, not the kind of loss that brings you to the fitting room at Jay's with your eyes controlled and your hands unsteady. But you live in the middle of other people's grief, all day, every day, which is its own kind of education. You have learned that grief is not one thing, not the single black weight you imagined before you came here, before you started handling the fabric of it every day. It is the Countess standing by her window, controlled and present, already calculating the practical necessities of going forward. It is the older daughter standing frozen in the morning room, choosing not to cry. It is the woman in the grey dress counting coins with exact precision. It is the widow who comes in for her second fitting in half mourning 6 months later, with slightly more colour in her cheeks and a slightly different quality to her eyes, who chooses a grey silk with just the right shade of lavender for the second skirt trim, who asks your opinion on the border detail with nothing approaching pleasure, because she is still in mourning, and the mourning is still real, but she's also still alive, and the grey and the lavender mean something, mean a season turning, mean the long, slow work of returning. It is the elderly woman who came in last month, asking for a small adjustment to a dress that was already 40 years old, a mourning dress she had kept since her husband died when she was 29, and which she wore every year on the anniversary of his death, which she did not explain to you, but which was visible in the careful state of the dress, the way it had been cleaned and stored and maintained, the way she handled it when you laid it on the table, with a care that said, "This is not a garment, this is a record. You cannot hold all of this at once, nobody can, but you hold as much as the work allows, and then you go back to the stitching. Stitch, draw, stitch, draw. This is your life now. The crepe and the bombazine and the widow's caps and the measuring tape and the cold basement room and the black dye under your thumbnails and the quiet voices of women in the worst moments of their lives and the particular smell of Courtaulds crepe at 4 a.m. when someone important has died. This is London in 1865, and you are in it, inside it, making something that matters in the way that most things that matter are invisible. The understructure, the right stitch in the right place, the veil at the right length, the dress that holds a woman together when everything in her wants to give way. You are 18 years old, and your hands know something that most people will never need to know. You get up from the table, you go upstairs. The attic room is cold in the way that November attic rooms are cold. Not bitter yet, not the deep winter cold of February, but the settled chill that says the summer warmth has fully gone, and what remains will persist until March. The small window shows the rooftops of Regent Street against the dark sky, the orange glow of the gas lamps below reflected against the low cloud. Your roommate, Jane, who arrived 2 months ago from Manchester, and who is still sometimes startled by the city's size, is already in bed, breathing steadily. She sleeps easily, Jane. You admire this. You sleep easily too most nights, which is the sleep of physical exhaustion, of a body that has used itself up in the work and surrenders to rest without argument. You light the small candle on the washstand, the stub from last night, which has perhaps an inch of life left in it. You sit on the edge of the bed and take off your boots with both hands, pulling at the heel. The familiar relief of removing something that has been on your feet for 15 hours. Your stockings have a grey-black tinge at the toe where dye has worked through. This is permanent now. All your stockings have this mark. You have written to your mother about this in one of your letters, meaning it as a small joke, something to describe the particular texture of this life. Your mother wrote back concerned and asked if the dye was causing harm, and you wrote back, "No, it's quite all right. It's only the fabric," which is true, and also the dye is in your skin, slightly, permanently, the way work gets into people, the way this city gets into people, the way any life lived fully in any particular place leaves its marks in the body. You take off your dress and hang it on the hook. In the candlelight the room smells of tallow and crepe, and the very faint camphor from the rental pieces you handled this afternoon. the smell of the day lingering. You blow the candle out. Dark. And in the dark, the sounds of London at night. The distant clatter of a late carriage on Regent Street. The muffled conversation of two people passing on the pavement below. A dog somewhere further off. A church bell striking the hour from somewhere north, and the faint echo of another bell answering from the east. And then silence again, or rather the particular texture of a city at night that is never quite silence, but is the closest it gets. You lie down. The straw mattress, which you noticed on your first night as scratchy and uncomfortable and entirely unlike the mattress at home, is now simply the surface on which you sleep, familiar as your own hands. You've slept on it for 8 months. It knows the shape of you by now. Your hands lie on the blanket in the dark. You cannot see them, but you know what they look like. The calluses at the fingertips, the grey line under the thumbnails, the slight roughness of the knuckle joints from the cold. They are not the hands you came here with. They are the hands this work has made. Tomorrow the work will begin again. Before 4 if another telegram comes, at 5 if it doesn't. Another order, another fitting, another woman in the worst moment of her life who needs the black to be right, so that the world will give her credit for her sorrow. You have learned, in 8 months, that the world is not especially interested in the inner reality of grief. The inner reality is invisible and unmeasurable, and not something that can be assessed from the pew behind. What the world can assess, and does, with the relentless precision of a society that runs on visible signals, is the outer reality, the fabric, the length, the weight of the veil, the correct trim on the bonnet brim. This is what you provide. This is what your hands know how to make. Outside, another carriage passes. The sound comes up through the walls of the building, through the floor, a distant rumble and clatter that fades into the street noise and disappears. You think about the Countess, in her house in Grosvenor Square, in whatever room she has chosen to sit in tonight, with the curtains drawn and the black on the door, and the older daughter somewhere sleeping or not sleeping, and the younger one dreaming or lying awake in the dark with the same question every child asks in the first nights after a parent dies. The question that doesn't have an answer. The question that the mourning dress and the widow's cap and the correct weight of the crape and every careful stitch of your day's work cannot answer, cannot touch, cannot do anything about at all. The question is, why? The dress is not an answer to why. The dress is what you wear while you live with not knowing why. It is the form that holds the grief in shape so that the grief does not collapse the person wearing it. It is the external structure when the internal one has failed. The correct black, the correct crape, the veil at the right length. These things cannot make the loss smaller, but they can make the world handle the loss correctly. They can ensure that every person who sees the widow sees the grief, acknowledges it, makes way for it, gives it the season it requires. They can do that much. You made those things today. Your hands made them. You close your eyes. The day was long. The work was right. The crepe trim lies flat against the bombazine, and the veil is the correct weight. And somewhere across London a woman is dressed in what you made for her, and the world, when it sees her tomorrow and the day after and for 2 years and 3 months to come, will know what she has lost. Your hands ache pleasantly, the ache of a day's good work spent, the ache of calluses and needles and 8 months of learning. Let it go. Let the workroom go. The gas jets and the cutting table and the smell of the logwood die. Let the Countess's morning room go. the white marble floor and the black crepe on the door, and the frozen face of the 14-year-old girl choosing not to cry. Let the woman in the grey dress go, her exact count of coins, her 4 children, her matter-of-fact dignity. Let the attic room hold you. The sounds of the city are softening, not because the city has stopped. It hasn't. It won't. It never does. But because you are moving away from it into the particular country that exists between waking and sleeping, where the sounds become abstract, become texture, become something that washes over the surface of the mind without landing. A distant bell, one stroke, the crepe bolts in the upper store dark in their wrappings waiting for whatever grief tomorrow brings. The widow's cap on its stand in the workroom white as paper trailing its black. The measuring tape coiled in your apron pocket. The attic room, Jane's breathing slow and steady. The cold settling into the corners of the room. The dark. Your hands on the blanket. You're 18 years old, and you have learned something that most people your age do not know. You've learned to look at the worst moments of other people's lives and see what is needed and provide it with care and precision and steady hands. You have learned that grief comes in different weights, and the weight matters. You have learned that what a person wears in sorrow is not vanity but armour, and that making that armour correctly is skilled work, honest work, work that the world depends on in the way that the world depends on bread and coal, and the men who mend the streets and the women who carry the water. It is quiet work. It is invisible work. The seamstress in the basement is not the one the street sees. The widow in the dress is the one the street sees. The work that holds the dress together disappears into the seams, but the seams hold. You close your eyes, and the dark is total and soft, and the city breathes its enormous breath outside the window, and underneath all of it, underneath the carriages and the coal smoke and the church bells and the late conversations and the gas lamps and the grief underneath all of it, there is the simple, persistent fact of rest. You have earned it. Take it. Let sleep come the way it came for Agnes Marsh in her attic room above the Morning Warehouse in 1865, after the long day of cutting and stitching and measuring other people's grief, after the hands have done their work and the needles are stilled, and the crepe lies folded in its wrappings, and the black dress hangs on the form in the workroom downstairs waiting. Let it come. Centuries will pass. The city you know will change past recognition. The gaslight will give way to electric light, and the electric light will brighten and sharpen until every street is as bright at midnight as it is at noon. The morning warehouses will close, one by one, as the Victorian rules of grief loosen and then finally dissolve, the 2 years and 3 months becoming 1 year, becoming 6 months, becoming nothing formal at all, just the private and uncalendared work of living after loss. Crepe will become a historical fabric, an artifact in museum collections, something curators pin behind glass with small labels explaining the weight and the smell and the social meaning. But the grief will not change. That won't change. People will still lose the people they love. Children will still stand frozen in rooms trying not to cry in front of strangers. Women will still count coins with exact precision, because there is dignity and exactness when everything else has come loose. Hands will still work through tiredness, through cold, through the long, slow hours of making something that someone needs. The human heart does not change. The need to mark the loss, to make it visible, to give it a shape that the world can see and acknowledge, that does not change either. And the work of the hands, the stitch, and the draw, the cold rooms and the difficult fabrics and the small precise movements that accumulate over months and years into knowledge built into the body, into the calluses and the dye stains and the particular angle of a wrist. That does not change. Here in the dark, here in the warmth of the blanket and the cold of the room, and the slow, deep breath of a body that has worked itself honest and is now finally at rest. Let it all go. Warm enough, quiet enough, safe enough. Your hands know what they know. Tomorrow they'll know more. Tomorrow the crepe bolts will come down from the shelves and the measuring tape will unroll and the needle will thread and the day will become what it becomes. But that is tomorrow. Morning comes before you're ready for it. Not the telegram knock this time, just the ordinary knock. Mrs. Fenn's knuckle against the door at 5:20, which sounds almost gentle compared to yesterday's alarm, but lands in your chest the same way, because sleep has its momentum, and 5:20 is still deep in the part of the morning that belongs to darkness. Deliveries at Simms, Mrs. Fenn says through the door. 3 fittings this morning. Her footsteps recede down the corridor. Jane is already sitting up, reaching for her stockings in the dark with the slightly mechanical efficiency of someone doing a thing they've done enough times that the body does it independent of the mind. You've noticed that Jane has gotten faster at this. 2 months ago she fumbled. Now her hands find the stockings the way yours find your buttons, without looking. The city teaches you your own body. You dress in the dark and go downstairs. The workroom in the early morning has a quality that the afternoon doesn't, a particular quality of cold and quiet that feels like the room itself before it wakes. The gas jets have been turned up, but the room hasn't yet reached working temperature, and your breath fogs slightly as you pull on your apron. The cutting tables are clean from last night, the tools laid out in their places, the irons cold on their stands. The bolts of crepe from yesterday's delivery sit against the wall in their sorted stacks. You put your hand on the nearest bolt, still slightly cool from the night. The texture is exactly as it always is, the particular drag of crepe under your palm, neither smooth nor rough, the ridges of the crimp against your fingertips. Your hands know this fabric the way a blacksmith's hands know iron. Not fondness exactly, recognition. Mr. Croft arrives at 5:45 and begins lighting the braziers for the irons. The gas jets in the ceiling hiss blue and yellow. The room begins to warm in the slow, incremental way of a room being asked to warm by inadequate means on a November morning. By 6 you're at the cutting table, and the deliveries have arrived. The deliveries at Jay's come from several directions simultaneously. Courtauld sends crepe on Tuesday and Saturday mornings, but there are also the other suppliers, the ribbons from a mercer in the city, the lawn for widow's caps from a draper in Oxford Street, the jet and black glass buttons from a manufacturer in Whitby who sends his London orders by the twice-weekly post, and the special orders, the items that cannot be made in-house, the black-edged handkerchiefs, monogrammed to order, that some clients consider essential, the morning stationery, similarly bordered, the black-dyed leather gloves that are ordered by the dozen for a family keeping large household staff who must all be correctly outfitted. Mourning a Victorian aristocrat, it turns out, requires mourning an entire ecosystem. The Earl of Whitbourne's household will need to dress the servants. Not in full mourning. Servants don't mourn in the same register as family, but in the correct markers. The male servants will wear black armbands. The female servants will wear black dresses if they don't already have them, which the housekeeper will see to from their own budgets or from an allowance from the estate, depending on the generosity of the establishment. The horses will wear black rosettes. The carriages will have black crape at the window frames for the period of deepest mourning. The death of a wealthy man ripples outward through the material world like a stone dropped in water, the rings of black spreading and spreading until they reach the edges of his household and stop. You sort the morning's deliveries. Lawn from the Oxford Street draper. You check the weight, which must be correct, not too stiff, not too soft, with a quality of drape that will allow it to form properly into the gathered and pleated shapes of a widow's cap, without looking either limp or rigid. This lawn is good. You record it. The ribbon, black grosgrain in 4 widths, from 1/4 inch to 2 inches. You check the colour, which sounds redundant until you understand that black in mourning is not one colour at all, but many. The flat matte black of crepe, which absorbs light. The slightly satin black of grosgrain ribbon, which has a controlled sheen. The deep but still lustrous black of silk, which reflects. The dense wool black of bombazine, which does neither but achieves its own gravity. Mixing these incorrectly, putting the wrong black next to the wrong black, creates what Mrs. Fenn calls a discordancy, a word she uses with minimal inflection, but which you've learned means something is wrong in a way that will be noticed by exactly the kind of woman who notices everything. You check that the grosgrain is the right black for grosgrain, which is to say, not crepe black, not silk black, not bombazine black, but grosgrain black. It is. You record it. The jet buttons. These are examined one by one, or rather by feel and by the small visual test of holding each one at an angle to the light. True Whitby jet, the fossilised wood from the cliffs of North Yorkshire, is lightweight and slightly warm under the fingers, and in the correct light has a very deep, very dark surface that doesn't quite reflect and doesn't quite absorb, but does something more complex than either, something that has made jet the preferred mourning stone in England for 300 years. Black glass, which is cheaper and more common, is heavier and colder and looks slightly different at the edges, harder, more definitive, less subtle. Jay's sells both. It sells them honestly, telling clients which is which. Clients make their own choices based on their means and preferences. Both are correct. But knowing the difference matters because a client who has ordered jet and received glass will know immediately, will know before she pins the first button, will know in her hands. You check each button. This lot is true jet. Light, warm, with that particular depth of surface. Good. The first fitting arrives at 9. She's a young woman, perhaps 23, with a wedding ring and a child's hand held in hers. She's not in mourning herself. Her dress is a dark blue, which is entirely wrong for mourning, and she knows this because she explains it before anyone can observe it. Her mother-in-law died yesterday, and she has come to be measured today. Her child is 3 years old, a boy with his mother's colouring, and he is wearing the expression of a child who's been promised something if he behaves himself, and is currently doing the maths on whether the behaving is worth the promised thing. She hands the boy to the attendant, who takes him to a chair in the corner with a firm but not unkind grip. The boy considers the situation and decides that complaining about it is not going to produce results, which is a more sophisticated calculation than you'd expect from a 3-year-old, and settles into the chair with a look of provisional acceptance. You take the woman's measurements. She is small, smaller than she looks when you see her standing still, and her hands, when they come up to hold the measuring tape, are very cold despite her gloves. She's been crying, you think, though not recently. The specific dryness around the eyes that follows crying, the slight redness that conceals itself under the powder she's applied this morning, and a gesture toward normality. her mother-in-law. Not her own mother, not her husband. There is a calculation in Victorian mourning for this relationship. The wife of a son mourns the husband's mother for 6 weeks in ordinary mourning, which means black but without the full crepe requirements of first mourning. 6 weeks. Then she can step back toward colour. This woman, you register as you record her measurements, is going to be in mourning for 6 weeks for a woman she may or may not have loved, with a child of 3 who will not understand why Mama is wearing black, and may not remember after 6 weeks what the normal colour of her dress was. This is also the mourning trade. You write the last measurement and thank her, and she goes with Mrs. Fenn to discuss the specifics, and you prepare the table for the next fitting. The next fitting is more straightforward. An older woman, perhaps 50, with the practised manner of someone who has been through this before, who knows the process, who has stood in this room in mourning dress before and will, in the steady arithmetic of a long life, probably stand here again. She's in second mourning already for her husband, who died 16 months ago, and has come to discuss the transition to half mourning, which she can begin in 3 months. Half mourning. This is its own geography. Half mourning. The transition out of black is not abrupt but graduated. First grey appears, the darkest possible grey, barely distinguishable from black in poor light. Then lighter grey. Then lavender, which is the mourning colour most associated with half mourning, a colour that exists in no other context with quite the same social weight. Then white and grey together. Then, finally, colour. Cautiously, in small measures. The woman considering this transition has the particular quality of someone who has thought very carefully about it, and wants to be sure she's not moving too fast, not signalling to the world something she doesn't intend to signal. She's not ready to signal anything, she explains to Mrs. Fenn, but she is tired. She did not say it quite that simply. She said it in the circumlocutory way of a Victorian woman of her generation and class, which means she said something about how one cannot wear bombazine indefinitely without some thought to the practicalities, and how one wishes to observe all that is proper, but perhaps there is some question of introducing a slight modification. Mrs. Fenn, who has heard this conversation in one form or another several hundred times, translates it instantly. Grey, she says, the darkest, nothing else yet. The lavender can wait. The woman's face at the word grey does something small and helpless and then recovers. 3 months. 3 more months in black and then grey, then the lavender, then colour, cautiously, in small measures. Then the whole thing ended officially, and she can go back to being herself again, or whoever she is now, which may not be exactly the same person who came into this room 16 months ago in first mourning. You measure her for the grey. The third fitting of the mourning is a girl of perhaps 16, accompanied by an older sister. Their father died in September, and they are at the transition to second mourning, which for a daughter means a reduction in crepe trim rather than a change in fabric. The girl has the look of someone who has been in mourning long enough that it has become her normal state, who cannot quite remember what she wore in colours, or how it felt to choose a fabric that wasn't black. She stands quietly while you pin. Her sister talks, not about the father, not about the grief, but about ordinary things, about a cousin's new house and a visit they're planning, and whether the train service to that particular destination has improved. This is what the older sister is doing, you understand. Talking about ordinary things loudly enough that the grief has to compete with them, that the girl standing in the fitting room is reminded by the steady ordinary conversation of her sister that there will be normal days again, that there are already normal things to talk about, It is a small, generous thing to witness. You finish pinning and step back. Perfect, you say, which is not strictly true but is close enough. By mid-morning you have been to the upper store for crepe twice, down to the delivery room for the widow's cap lawn once, and across the main floor to consult with Mrs. Fenn about a specific shade of grey grosgrain that is currently in dispute. The dispute is between what the client ordered and what the supplier has delivered, which is a slightly bluer grey when it should be a slightly warmer grey, and the difference is invisible to most people, but not to a woman who is going to wear this ribbon every day for 3 months, next to skin that has been in heavy black mourning for 16 months, and which will make the cool grey versus warm grey question visible in ways that the supplier's sample room does not anticipate. You take out both the sample and the delivered ribbon and hold them next to a sheet of white paper in the window light. The supplier is wrong. The ribbon is too cool. You write the note for Mrs. Fenn and go back to your cutting table. It is while you're at your cutting table working on the hem trim for a second morning cape that you hear it. Not from inside the building, from outside, from the street. The particular sound that Regent Street makes when something is passing that makes it quiet around it. The traffic noise fading, the street vendors lowering their voices, the footsteps of pedestrians slowing slightly as people pause to watch. A funeral procession. You've heard this before many times because Regent Street is a major thoroughfare and funeral processions pass regularly, taking their elaborate routes from church to cemetery through the city. But you always look. It is impossible not to look. You set down your needle and go to the small high window. From this angle, from the basement window that sits just at pavement level, your view of the street is specific. Feet and wheels and the lower portions of whatever is passing. But a funeral procession at this level is still unmistakable. The black horses first, their hooves on the cobblestones with a slower, more deliberate sound than ordinary horses, as though they have been trained to match the pace of grief. The undertaker's men walking beside them in their long black coats and their tall black hats with crepe bands, their faces composed in the professional expression of men who've been paid to embody solemnity. The hearse, which at this angle shows you its lower half only, the black lacquered panels, the carved wooden scroll work, the wheels, and through the glass panels of the hearse sides, slightly above your view but catching the light, the edge of something draped in black and covered in flowers, the coffin, white flowers mostly, some black-edged ribbon visible at one edge. The flowers have the slight over-arranged quality of flowers placed by a professional, by the undertaker's men, which means this is a family that could afford the full service including the flower arrangements, which means a family with money, with standing, with the resources to do this correctly. Behind the hearse, a line of black carriages. You cannot see into them from here, but you know what is in them. The mourners, in the correct clothes, in the correct weight of crepe, with the correct length of veil, going to bury someone. Maybe someone at Jay's dressed them. It's possible. This is the neighbourhood. The procession passes. The sound of the horses diminishes. The street noise returns to its ordinary pitch. The carriages, the vendors, the footsteps, the constant London noise that underlies everything the way the ground underlies buildings. You go back to your cutting table. But the procession stays with you, as it always does, as a kind of calibration. This is what the work becomes. Not dress forms and fabric bolts, but this. The black horses on the wet cobblestones and the flowers through the glass and the carriages of mourners dressed in the correct weight, and the procession making its deliberate way through the ordinary life of the city. The dress matters, the weight of the crepe matters. The widows in those carriages are being carried through a city that will see them, that will register the precision of their grief in the precision of their dress, that will give them the respect of correct observing. You made this possible for someone this week. Yesterday's work, the Countess's dress and the daughter's pieces, the morning cape and the half-morning transition, all of it adding to the enormous, invisible infrastructure of a society's relationship with loss. Your needle threads itself. Your hands go back to work. The morning passes into afternoon. There are things about working in the morning trade that you did not know before you came here, and that no one tells you before you start, things that reveal themselves gradually over the months of the work. The first is this, that morning dress is not only worn by the bereaved. You understood before you came that the rules of mourning applied to families, to the defined grades of relationship that dictated how long and how deeply each person must dress in black. What you did not know was the extent to which mourning dress extends outward into social performance, into the calculation of appearances, into choices that have as much to do with social signalling as with grief. A woman who has no particular connection to the deceased may wear mourning if the deceased is prominent enough and the occasion important enough. At the funeral of a very great person, the public expression of mourning from those not directly bereaved is expected and is itself a social statement. When the Prince Consort died in December 1861, a significant portion of London's female population went into some form of mourning dress in solidarity with the Queen. Not all of them had any personal connection to Albert. Many of them had never seen him closer than a newspaper illustration. But the wearing of black was both a gesture of loyalty and a piece of social positioning. To be seen as correctly observing the national grief was to be seen as correctly placed in the social order. You know this because a woman told you during a fitting 2 months into your tenure at Jay's that she'd been perfectly happy to leave mourning after her own father died 3 years ago, and had just gotten comfortable in colour again when the Prince Consort died, and she'd had to go back into black, and it had been, she said, very inconvenient. She said this without particular embarrassment, which suggested she did not consider it a contradiction. The second thing you did not know is that death is an industry, and the mourning trade is only one part of it. This becomes visible to you over months of working at Jay's, of watching the connections and connections of connections that constitute Victorian death commerce. The undertaker supplies the coffin and the hearse and the mutes and the feathermen with their black plumes for the horses. The stonemason supplies the headstone and its carved inscription. The printers supply the black-bordered death announcements sent to all the family's acquaintance. The stationer supplies the black-bordered notepaper on which the widow will write her thank-you notes for the condolences. The jeweller supplies the mourning jewellery, the jet brooch, the black enamel locket, the gold ring set with black stone, and the mourning warehouse supplies the dress. All of these people are connected, not formally but practically, through the network of the trade. Jay's recommends undertakers, and undertakers recommend Jay's. Jewellers who specialise in mourning jewellery keep Jay's cards on their counters. It is not corruption, this network. It is the efficient operation of an ecosystem that has grown up around the fact that death is regular and grief is required to be visible, and visible grief requires goods and services that must come from somewhere. The mourning trade is worth, in London alone, hundreds of thousands of pounds annually. This is not a small trade. This is not a niche industry. This is one of the significant commercial operations of the city, sustaining the Courtauld mills and the Whitby jet carvers and the tailors and the seamstresses and the button manufacturers and the ribbon merchants and the undertakers and their suppliers, all of it turning on the fact that someone has died, and the people around them must dress accordingly. You think about this sometimes while you work, the sheer economic weight of grief. The third thing you did not know before you came to Jay's is about hair. Mourning jewellery that incorporates the hair of the deceased is common. You knew this in the abstract as something people did. What you did not know until you watched it happen is what it looks like in practice, which is both more intimate and more strange than the phrase suggests. A woman came in on a Tuesday in October, perhaps 2 months after your arrival, carrying a small paper packet. She was in mourning for her son, who had died of typhoid in August at the age of 19. She wanted, she explained to Mrs. Fenn, a locket mounted with his hair, and she had brought the hair, the paper packet. She opened it on the counter, and there was the hair, a small curl of dark hair, tied at its base with a thread. Just that, just hair. But it was his hair, cut from his head at some point after he died, or perhaps before, in anticipation. And it had been held in this paper packet. This woman had carried this paper packet with her to Regent Street on a Tuesday in October, and she was asking for it to be preserved. Jay's worked with a jeweller 3 streets over for exactly this purpose. Mrs. Fenn took the packet carefully, noted the instructions, filled out the order form for the jeweller. The woman watched the packet leave her hands, and something in her face that had been very tightly held for a moment released slightly and then recomposed itself. You were at your cutting table when this happened. You were not supposed to be watching, but you were watching. Mourning jewellery made from the deceased's hair, brooches woven from it, rings with a glass-covered compartment containing it, earrings twisted from it. The Victorians were not squeamish about this practice. It was not considered morbid in the way that later generations would find it morbid. It was considered a continuation of presence, a way of keeping something physical when the body itself was gone. The hair was real. It had been part of him. It was therefore him, in some small, irreducible physical sense, and the brooch, or the locket, or the ring was a way of carrying that with you. You have, since October, helped prepare 3 such items for the jeweller. Each time the paper packet comes across the counter, each time the hair is revealed, dark or grey or once memorably, the vivid copper red of a 4-year-old child who died of a fever, you feel the same thing. The collision of the ordinary physical object with its absolute weight. Just hair. That is all it is, and it is everything. The 4th thing you did not know about the mourning trade is the thing that nobody discusses directly, but that is present in every room and every transaction, and every measuring tape measurement. The difference between what mourning dress costs and what most people earn. You earn 7 shillings a week. This is a standard wage for a junior seamstress at an establishment of Jay's quality. It is not a bad wage for a single woman with her accommodation included. You eat adequately. You sleep in a room that is cold in winter but dry. You have an apron and the tools of your trade and the education of your work, which is worth money even if it's not paid in money. A complete mourning outfit for a woman of the Countess's rank costs more than you earn in 6 months. More, possibly in 8. A complete mourning outfit for a woman of the middle classes, a doctor's wife or a merchant's widow, costs more than you earn in 2 months. A rental dress for a day cost more than a day's wages. The woman in the grey dress who came in yesterday with her 4 children counted out the rental cost from a purse that had to be managed carefully. You watched her count. The counting was the information, and yet the social pressure to dress correctly in mourning is, for most women, absolute. The woman who cannot afford the mourning dress still faces the world's assessment of her grief through the dress she wears. She faces the neighbours and the church and the women's committee and the social networks through which her life is lived, all of them reading her clothes for the signal that is supposed to be there. What happens to the woman who cannot provide the signal? She borrows, she rents, she dyes her one good dress black, which works reasonably well if the dress is dark to begin with, and less well if it isn't. She borrows from a cousin or a neighbour who has mourning clothes from a previous bereavement, which means wearing someone else's grief cut to someone else's body. She improvises with black ribbons and black trim on an existing dress, which a careful seamstress can do well enough to pass at a distance. She does what she can, and the world still assesses her. You know all of this now. You know it with the specific knowledge of someone who handles the fabric of it daily, who sees the entire range of response to a single social requirement, from the Countess's house in Grosvenor Square to the woman in the grey dress and her exact count of coins. The range is vast. The requirement is the same. This is the mourning trade. You're trimming the hem of a half-mourning cape, a grey wool trimmed with black grosgrain. The correct grey, the replacement having arrived from the supplier by midday with a note of apology. The grey is correct now, warm rather than cool, barely distinguishable from black in the workroom's gaslight, but correct in the daylight that the client will actually live her life in. Your hands know the work. The hem lies flat under your left thumb. The needle draws through and back. Ellen, across the table, is working on something that requires close attention and has therefore not spoken in 2 hours, which is normal. The sound of the room is the sound it always is. Work. The irons hiss occasionally. Somewhere upstairs, a fitting room consultation produces the low murmur of voices. The street outside offers its constant undercurrent of carriage wheels and footsteps, and the occasional shout of a vendor. London, working, moving, going on with itself regardless. At 2 in the afternoon, Mrs. Fenn comes to the cutting room with a visitor. This is unusual. The cutting room is not a public space. Clients are received in the fitting rooms upstairs and in the showroom. The cutting room is for the work, not for the showing. Mrs. Fenn does not bring people down here. But this man apparently is not a client. He's perhaps 50, with the broad build of someone who spent an earlier part of his life doing physical work, and the particular careful dress of a man who has recently come into money or status, sufficient to require better clothes than he grew up with. His coat is very black, very good. His hat is the tall silk hat of his profession, held in both hands. He is an undertaker. You know this not because Mrs. Fenn introduces him, but because you have seen enough of them in the past 8 months to know the type, the particular combination of physical solidity and professional gravity, the very good black coat, the something in the way they hold themselves that says, I have seen the worst thing, and I am prepared for it. And that preparation is my product. Mr. Hargreave, Mrs. Fenn says, is inquiring about the crepe supply for the Blackwood estate funeral next week. The Blackwood funeral. You know about this already. It's been discussed in the workroom because the Blackwood estate is prominent enough that the preparations have been noted across several of London's trades. A very old, very wealthy family, a patriarch of 82 who has died in September, and whose funeral was delayed by matters of estate and family gathering, and has now been set for next week, which means that every trade involved is currently in the final stages of preparation. For the undertaker, crepe is essential. not just for the mourning dress, which is Jay's domain, but for the dressing of the hearse, the draping of the household, the wrapping of the coffin, the trim on the mute staves, and the plumes on the horses, and the festooning of the church for the service. A funeral at the level of the Blackwood estate uses an extraordinary quantity of black crape. Mr. Hargreave and Mrs. Fenn confer quietly. You hear the numbers. 40 yards for the hearse drapery alone, a figure which means that the hearse will be transformed, that every visible surface will be covered in the heavy black mourning fabric, that the vehicle will become a sort of mobile monument to the weight of this loss rather than merely a conveyance. Then Mr. Hargreave's eyes move across the workroom, taking in the tables and the seamstresses and the fabric stacks and the irons, with the assessing eye of a professional who thinks about the material reality of death commerce every day. They land briefly on you, register your presence with the same minimal acknowledgement he'd give a piece of furniture, and move on. You don't mind this. Invisibility is a working condition you've become comfortable with. Mrs. Fenn makes a note in her ledger. The crepe will be prepared and delivered by Thursday, which gives the undertaker 2 days before the funeral. Mr. Hargreave nods, retrieves his hat, and leaves the way he came. Mrs. Fenn's eyes sweep the cutting room as she follows him out. They pause briefly on your table, registering the state of the hemwork, and then she is gone. Stitch, draw. You think about the Blackwood funeral as you work. 40 yards of crape for the hearse alone. The cost of that quantity of fabric at current prices, the cost of the funeral as a whole, the hearse, the horses in their black plumes, the mutes at the door, the carriages for the family, the church arrangements, the stone, the inscription, the black-bordered announcement printed and sent to the entire family's acquaintance, the mourning dresses for the family women, the mourning armbands for the male servants. A large aristocratic funeral in 1865 can cost several £1,000s. Several £1,000s, when a dressmaker earns 7 shillings a week, and the woman in the grey dress counts out her rental cost from a carefully managed purse. This is the arithmetic of Victorian death. The display of grief is a form of social performance, and like all social performance, it is most accessible to those with resources. The poor bury their dead too, have always buried their dead, will always bury their dead. But the burial is different. A pauper's burial, a parish coffin, a common grave, no hearse, no mutes, no crape on the door, no black-bordered announcement, no 40 yards of anything. Just the body and the ground, and whatever words can be said, and whatever grief can be carried without the help of fabric. You have never seen a pauper's funeral. Jay's does not service pauper funerals. But you know what they look like from the accounts of women who grew up in the streets where they happen, who have told you in the shorthand of shared understanding how different the other end of the scale looks. The parish coffin carried on a hand-cart, the grave in the corner of the churchyard that no one marks because there are too many of them to mark, the family walking behind in their everyday clothes because there is no mourning to put on and no money for renting. The grief the same, the material reality completely different, and the world's assessment of that grief measured against the standard set by the correct crepe and the correct bombazine and the correct widow's veil at the correct length. The world's assessment lands differently on the woman who cannot provide the signal. This is what the scissors are cutting all day, every day. Not just dress. The distance between the grief that the world acknowledges fully and the grief that the world barely sees. You know this. You hold this knowledge as you work. It doesn't change the stitching. It doesn't change what needs to be done. But it is there, underneath the work, as a weight that your hands have learned to carry without being crushed by. The afternoon passes. The November light in the high windows shifts from grey to orange to nothing, and the gas jets are fully up by 4 o'clock, and the room has reached its working temperature and then past it, so that there is a comfortable warmth from the irons and the bodies and the gas, a warmth that will make the cold of the attic room sharper by contrast when you get there at the end of the day. Mrs. Bellingham, the senior seamstress, comes to inspect your hem at 4:30. Mrs. Bellingham inspects everything, always, and says nothing if everything is correct, which means her presence at your table is less alarming than it was in the early months. She bends over the work with her small steel-frame spectacles and examines the stitching at close range. She says nothing. She moves on. This is the compliment. At 5 o'clock there is commotion in the front of the building that reaches the cutting room as a change in air pressure, a particular quality of agitation that works its way through walls and floors and arrives in the workroom as a slight increase in alertness among the seamstresses, who look up collectively and then go back to work when nothing further develops. But then Mrs. Fenn comes down. She closes the cutting room door behind her, which she almost never does, and stands for a moment at the foot of the stairs with her hands folded and a look on her face that is not quite the look of a crisis, but is the look of something that requires management. The Countess of Whitbourne's household has sent a message, she says. The elder daughter has been unwell this afternoon. She will not be able to attend the funeral tomorrow in the dress we've made, as she has... Mrs. Fenn pauses, selecting her words. The dimensions have changed somewhat since this morning. You look up from your work. So does Ellen, so does Sarah Pugh, who is across the room but who has very good ears. The elder daughter, 14 years old, her father died 2 nights ago. She stood in her mother's morning room this morning, with a frozen face trying not to cry in front of strangers. Has been unwell this afternoon. The dimensions have changed somewhat. You understand immediately. Grief in a 14-year-old body is not a politely distributed force. It is the kind of force that attacks the stomach and the chest and the legs, and that can, over the course of a morning and an afternoon of holding itself under strict control in front of strangers and mothers and governesses and dressmakers, produce in a young person the kind of physical response that is not precisely illness, but is the body finally doing what the face refused to do. The dress you made was measured this morning. The girl who will wear it tomorrow is not quite the same size as the girl who stood still for you in the morning room 8 hours ago. How much? Sarah asks. 1 inch at the waist, perhaps a little more. Sarah nods, already standing. 2 hours. Mrs. Fenn. 1. The family is sending a carriage at 7. Sarah is already at the fabric cabinet. You're already threading a new needle. The right thread, black silk, the same thread you were using all morning. The thread that your hands have been on for 8 months, that your fingers know the weight and draw of before it goes through the eye. Agnes, Sarah says without looking up, you're fastest at the side seams. Come. You go. The dress is brought out from the hanging room where it has been waiting in its paper wrappings. Unwrapped, it is beautiful in the specific sense that morning dress is beautiful. Complete, correct, heavy with meaning. The bombazine falls in the proper deep folds. The crepe trim lies absolutely flat. The hem is even to a fraction of an inch. You take a seam ripper and find the side seam with your thumb, 1 inch at the waist. It sounds small. It is not small. 1 inch at the waist, let out symmetrically at both side seams while maintaining the line of the bodice boning and the position of the crepe trim without disturbing it, and without leaving any trace of the adjustment that might be visible to a sharp-eyed person at a funeral tomorrow. This is a precise operation. Your hands move. This seam ripper travels along the side seam from the waist to the hip. a careful measurement, the insertion of a dart adjustment, which means opening, repositioning, and reclosing a very specific portion of a very specific seam while maintaining the exact position of everything around it. Sarah is doing the opposite side simultaneously, both of you working toward the centre of the dress, both of you in the particular concentration of people doing precision work under time pressure. Neither of you speaks. The gas jets hiss. The room has emptied of most of the other seamstresses, who have gone up for supper and who are not aware of the emergency. The workroom at this hour has a different quality. Quieter. The tools at rest. The fabric on the tables in various states of completion. The smell is the same as always, dye and crepe and the faint iron tang. But without the warmth of bodies, it has settled back into itself and the cold is beginning to creep in at the edges. Your fingers are slightly cold. You don't let them slow. At 6:30 the dress is reassembled and pressed and inspected. Sarah goes over every inch of the altered seam in the light of the gas jet, looking for anything that will show, any place where the fabric has been stressed or the crepe has been disturbed. She finds nothing. She holds it up and it hangs as it hung this morning. The correct black, the correct weight, the correct fall of the skirt. Good, she says. You start cleaning your space. Sarah carries the dress upstairs herself to be repackaged, and you hear the front door open at 7 as the carriage arrives, and you hear the exchange of voices at the door as the salesman confirms the delivery, and then the sound of the door closing, and then nothing. The dress is gone. Tomorrow it will go to the funeral. The girl who wears it will be smaller than the measurements this morning, and the dress will fit correctly, and no one at the funeral will know that it was adjusted at 6:30 in the evening by two women working in a cold room with cold fingers to an inch at the waist. The seams will hold. You wash your hands at the basin in the corner of the cutting room, the water cold because it was cold an hour ago and no one has replaced it. The black from the dye comes off some of it, the loose surface dye, but the grey line under your thumbnails stays as it always stays. You dry your hands on the linen towel that hangs on the hook. You go upstairs for supper. Supper is bread and cold meat, the same as most evenings, and tea that is still just about hot enough if you drink it immediately. The small kitchen off the back of the building, where the staff eat, smells of coal and bread, and the particular warmth of a room that has had food cooked in it earlier in the day. Jane is already there, eating with the systematic efficiency of someone who is tired and hungry in that order. You eat. Across from you, Mary Hayward is telling a story about a customer who came in today in mourning that was technically correct, but practically unusual. The story involves a degree of research Mary has evidently done on her own time into the precise interpretation of mourning rules for a woman who has been widowed twice. The question is whether the second widowing's mourning period begins from scratch or accumulates to the first. The answer, you have gathered from 8 months of listening to Mrs. Fenn discuss such matters, is complicated. She's in the middle of the mourning for her first husband, Mary is explaining, and then her second husband dies, so does she go back to day 1, or does she somehow average it? Or does she just wear the same black she was already wearing and call it sufficient? Ellen, who is reading a newspaper and eating simultaneously, says without looking up, she wears what she has and tells no one the details. This seems to satisfy the table as a practical answer, if not a technically precise one. You drink your tea and think about the girl in the dress, about the altered seams, about the funeral tomorrow, about the boy at the fitting this morning, the 3-year-old in the chair who looked at the room with provisional acceptance and who will grow up with only the vaguest memory of this day, if any, who will know that there was a time when his mother was in black but won't remember the particular morning of the fitting or the cold measuring room or the child version of himself sitting in a chair calculating whether the promised reward was worth the required behaviour. Memory works like that. The specific dissolves. What remains is the emotional truth of a time, the feeling of it without the details. The boy will not remember the fabric, but something in him will carry the weight of these weeks. This is what you carry from the work. Not the technical knowledge only, though the technical knowledge is real and useful and built into your hands. What you carry is the knowledge that the fabric was present at the worst moments, that the stitching happened in the same rooms as the grief, that your hands were there. You cannot make the grief smaller, but you can make the dress right. That is your work. That is what it is. You finish your tea and take your plate to the basin and go upstairs. The weeks move as they do in a busy establishment, which is to say that they move in the way that immersion moves, not as distinct days with clear edges, but as a continuous present in which the differences accumulate slowly into changes you notice only when you stop to look back. You started at Jay's in October, and it is now past November, and what has changed is not dramatic, but is definitive. The work that required effort now happens in the body almost without the mind. The clients who made you nervous now simply require attention. The fabrics that felt foreign under your hands now feel like parts of your own vocabulary. The crepe and the bombazine and the grey grosgrain and the widow's lawn all speaking to your fingertips in languages you have learned. Mrs. Fenn gives you a more complex fitting toward the middle of November, a second morning consultation that requires an extended discussion with a client about the transition to half mourning, which means sitting in the fitting room as the second body in the room, present but background, taking notes and occasionally offering an observation when asked. The client is a woman of about 40 who has been in mourning for 13 months for her husband, and who has opinions about Gray that she is expressing in considerable detail. You sit and you listen, and when Mrs. Fenn asks you what you think about the grey wool sample versus the grey silk foulard for the main dress, you say what you actually think, which is that the wool will last better in daily wear, but the silk moves more naturally in a social setting. And given that this woman will be coming out of mourning gradually and will be beginning to attend events again in the next months, the silk makes more sense for the purpose. Mrs. Fenn is silent for a moment. Then, quite right. To the client, the silk. The client looks at you for the first time in the conversation, which means she is seeing you for the first time, which means the invisibility that is your normal working state has briefly broken. You meet her eye and then return to your notebook. After the client leaves, Mrs. Fenn says nothing about the exchange, but at the end of the day she assigns you your first solo second morning consultation for the following Tuesday. A regular client, someone Mrs. Fenn knows will not be difficult, but a solo consultation nonetheless. You think about this in the attic room that night, in the dark, with the city outside the window, your first solo consultation, the measuring tape and the notebook and the responsibility of it entirely your own. You're 8 months into a trade that will take years to fully learn. You're 18 years old in a city that contains everything, including the worst and the best of what people are capable of. You have learned that grief is a language, and fabric is its grammar, and that the grammar must be precise or the language fails. You have learned to find your dress in the dark. You have learned the weight of crepe in your hands and the temperature of good jet buttons, and the difference between correct grey and almost correct grey that will look wrong in daylight. You have learned to be in a room full of someone else's grief and to work steadily inside it, to let your hands do what your hands know how to do, while the grief goes where grief goes. These are the things your body knows now. Tomorrow will bring what it brings. Another telegram or not. Another fitting or not. Another delivery of crepe from Courtaulds, in its brown paper wrapping with the particular smell of freshly prepared mourning fabric that is now and will likely always be the smell of this time in your life. The smell that will come back to you decades from now, if you catch it somewhere unexpectedly, in a fabric shop, in a room where someone old has old clothes stored. The smell that will bring this room back, this cold basement cutting room, these women bent over their work in the gaslight, the particular smell of your working life. You close your eyes. December comes. It comes to Regent Street the way December comes to any London street. Through the light first, the sun now so low in the sky that even when it appears, which is not often, it barely clears the rooftops before descending again, leaving the day to make do with a kind of prolonged grey dusk. The gas lamps are lit before 3 in the afternoon. The fog comes in from the Thames on certain mornings and sits in the streets for hours, the particular yellow-grey London fog that smells of coal and river, and something that is neither and both, and through which the gas lamps glow at a distance like small warm intentions. The cold deepens, not brutally yet, not the hard cold of January, but a settled, persistent cold that lives in the floors and the walls of the building, and that the braziers in the cutting room moderate but cannot defeat. You learn the specific winter cold of crepe, which is colder than it has any right to be given how light it is, because the fabric doesn't trap air the way a heavier weave does, because the crimp is decorative rather than functional in thermal terms. Crepe in winter cuts through your hands in a way that summer crepe doesn't. You rub tallow into your knuckles before bed, as Mary advised, and it helps somewhat. But by the middle of December, the first small crack has opened at the base of your right index finger, and the dye gets into it, and you are learning a particular management of the needle angle that avoids putting pressure on that finger. Your hands in winter. This is also the knowledge of the trade built into the body. December brings a particular quality of morning demand that is seasonal. The cold and the dark accelerate certain deaths, the elderly, the already frail, the very young. Influenza moves through the city. Coal smoke and insufficient ventilation and the damp of poorly heated houses do their work. The morning warehouses are never exactly slow, but December has its own character of business, a heavier, more constant press of demand. You are measuring and cutting and stitching through all of it. One evening in the second week of December, after the day's work is finished and the other seamstresses have gone, you're in the upper store checking the crepe stock when you hear something from the street above. Singing. Not the vendors who have long since packed up in the cold and dark, not the usual street noise of the evening, something else. A choir moving along Regent Street, their voices rising through the cold air and through the stone of the building and down through the floor and into the fabric room where you're standing with a bolt of crepe in your hands. Carol singers. Of course, December. You stand in the fabric room with the crepe bolt in your arms and listen to the voices come closer and reach the building and pass it. The particular beauty of many voices in a cold outdoor space in the dark, the sound carrying further and more clearly than it would in any room, because cold air holds sound differently than warm. The melody is something you know from home, from the church in Hatfield Broad Oak, from childhood Decembers that smelled of pine and cold stone and candle wax rather than crepe and logwood dye. The voices pass. The sound diminishes. You stand in the fabric room for a moment longer than necessary. Then you put the crepe back on its shelf, close the cabinet and go down the ladder. There are things the morning trade cannot touch. The carol singers, the frost that makes the attic window beautiful in the early morning, the fern patterns of ice on the inside of the glass, the particular quality of very cold air when you first step out into it, the way your lungs register it as a shock and then adjust, the smell of the kitchen when someone has baked, the laugh that comes out of Jane unexpectedly when something is funny, her whole body surprised by it, life pressing in at the edges of the black. In this way, December passes, the new year comes, which in London in 1865 is less a formal celebration than an incremental adjustment in the date on the top of letters and invoices, though there are those who observe it. You observe it by being slightly later to bed on the 31st and slightly slower to rise on the 1st of January, which Mrs. Fenn does not comment on when you arrive in the cutting room at 6:15 rather than 6, which you take to mean that the observation is acknowledged if not officially sanctioned. January is the hardest month in the cold room. Your hands crack at both index fingers now, the dye finding its way in. You manage. Mrs. Fenn gives you a small jar of something, a thick, pale preparation that smells faintly of beeswax, without explanation or ceremony, leaving it on your cutting table one morning. You understand it to be the establishment's version of tallow, a professional solution to the professional problem of hands that must work in cold conditions. You apply it at night. It helps more than the tallow did. A small kindness in the way that Mrs. Fenn offers all kindnesses without naming them. You are 9 months into this trade. Your hands know crepe in all weathers. Your eye knows the difference between the correct grey and the almost correct grey without needing the window to check. Your measuring tape feels like an extension of your arm. The widow's cap construction happens almost without reference to the template, because the template has been absorbed into your hands. You're becoming something, not the seamstress you arrived as, the girl who fumbled buttons in the dark and fumbled crepe under scissors and didn't know the weight of Whitby jet, or the temperature of bombazing just unwrapped from its wrapping. Something more. Something made from 8 months of this particular place, and this particular work and the particular education of grief, observed daily at close range. You had a life before this, a village and a family and a way of knowing the world that came from that village and that family. You still have that life, in the sense that you carry it, that it is inside you, that when the carol singers go past in December, you hear the church in Hatfield Broad Oak. You can write home. You do write home. Your mother writes back with news of people you grew up with, the ordinary news of an ordinary village, the births and the marriages and the small local economies and the weather. But you also have this. The cutting room and the crepe and the widow's cap and the measuring tape and the woman in the grey dress and the older daughter standing frozen and the paper packet of dark hair on the counter. These are yours too. This is also who you are becoming, in the particular way that cities make new people out of the people who arrive in them, by layering the city over the person until the person and the city are inseparable, until you cannot quite find where London ends and Agnes Marsh begins. You are a Londoner now, or near enough. You are a morning dressmaker now, or near enough. Both of these things are recent, and both feel permanent. February brings the first hints, barely perceptible, of the world deciding to go on. The light is still thin and early, and the cold is still committed. But on certain mornings you walk from the building to the delivery room at the back and notice that the light is slightly different. that the grey of the sky has a quality it didn't have in January, that the cold has a quality of yielding rather than advancing. On one such morning, a Thursday, Mrs. Fenn stops you in the corridor and says that the second morning consultation last week went well, that Mrs. Hartington has placed a follow-on order for the half-morning accessories, and that Mrs. Hartington mentioned your name specifically in a way that was complimentary. Mrs. Fenn says this in exactly the tone she uses to say everything else. Then she walks away. You stand in the corridor for a moment. Then you go to the cutting room and start work. The day has the rhythm of all days at Jay's, and the rhythm has the feeling now of something right, something properly yours, the work finding you as you find it, and the two of you proceeding together through the hours in the particular partnership of a person and a trade that has gone past the early difficulties into the steadier country of competence. Stitch, draw, stitch, draw. Evening comes, the gas jet's low, the room quiet, your hands resting. You go upstairs, the attic room in February. Jane is asleep. The frost patterns on the inside of the window have learned the particular shapes of February frost, which are different from January's, thinner, more tentative, as though the winter itself is beginning to reconsider. You take off your boots, your dress on the hook. In the dark, the smell of crepe, the grey line under your thumbnails, the calluses at the fingertips, the tallow and beeswax smell of the hand treatment you've applied since January, the hands of your working life. You lie down. The city outside. February London. The streets beginning to remember what they look like when they are not entirely frozen. The river moving with something approaching confidence again. The first very tentative gestures towards spring from the window boxes and the park trees and the light itself. Everything is still mostly winter, but the direction has changed. You can feel it even here, in the attic room, through the thin walls of a building full of black fabric and the work of grief. Something turning, not dramatically. Not as though winter is over, just the direction changed. The long, slow tipping of the season away from the cold and toward whatever comes next. You think, this is what half-mourning is. Not joy, not the end of grief. Just the first small shift in direction. The first grey introduced at the edge of the black. The first acknowledgement that the season is turning, even if the full warmth is still months away. Even if the bombazine is still right and the crepe is still present and the veil is still long. Half-mourning, the beginning of the return, your hands on the blanket, cold and warm at once. Cold from the room, warm from the work, from the day's accumulated heat of closeness and effort. Let the workroom go, let the crepe lie folded in its wrappings in the upper store, waiting for the grief that will come tomorrow, because it always comes tomorrow, because the city is always in the process of losing someone, and the someone always leaves a ring of black spreading outward through the people who remain. Let the widow's cap sit on its stand in the fitting room. Let the measuring tape coil in its drawer. Let January give way to February and February to March, the long, slow turning of the season, the gradual lifting of the dark. You are here. You are warm enough, fed enough, competent enough. You have a trade in your hands, a real trade, built from the patience of months and the education of difficult work and the particular learning that comes from being present with other people's grief without being destroyed by it. You have that. You have this city, which is difficult and enormous and full of everything at once, and which has accepted you, in its offhand way, by simply requiring you to keep up, and which you have kept up with. You have your hands, which know crepe in all its weights and bombazine in all its densities and the exact proportion of a widow's cap and the angle of a needle through close-woven black silk thread, which have been dyed grey at the thumbnails and calloused at the fingertips and cracked at the knuckle joints and treated with beeswax and tallow, and have kept going regardless, which have made, in 8 months, something like several hundred pieces of morning dress, each one handled with care, each one stitched with the precision that the work requires, each one worn by a woman in a specific moment of her life that required her to dress her grief correctly. Your hands have been there for all of it. Let them rest now. Let the dark come. Let the sounds of February London, the carriages and the wind and the distant bells, and the river somewhere beneath all of it. Always the river, always moving, always carrying the commerce and the grief and the living and the dead through the city toward the sea. Let all of it soften at the edges and become texture without meaning, sound without content, the background of the world going on while you rest inside it. The February frost on the window, Jane's breathing slow and steady, the breathing of someone deeply asleep, your own breath slowing, the calluses on your fingertips warm now in the warmth of the blanket. These are yours, the trade in your hands, the city in your bones, the grey line under your thumbnails that no amount of washing removes, all yours, all real, all part of the particular life you're living in this particular place, in this particular year, which will become the particular past that you carry forward into every year after this, that will be in your hands when you're 20 and 30 and 40, when you touch fabric in any room for the rest of your life, and your fingers know it immediately, when you smell crepe and smell this room and this city and this year, and the work that made you who you became. Let it all be. Let it rest. Centuries will pass and the morning warehouses will close and the strict calculus of grief will ease and the crepe will go to museum cases with their small labels and their careful lighting. The women who wore it will be names on headstones, if that. The seamstresses who made it will be mostly nameless, in the way that people who do the invisible necessary work are mostly nameless. Their labour absorbed into the fabric, and the fabric absorbed into the world, and the world gone on without them. But the hands, the work of hands, that does not disappear. That goes forward in the thing that was made, in the dress that held together through the funeral, in the seam that was let out at 6:30 in the evening so that a girl of 14 could stand at her father's grave without her dress pulling at the waist, so that she had one less thing to manage on the worst day of her young life. That work was done, the seams held, and somewhere, in the long forward reach of time, in the houses and the museums and the archive boxes where Victorian morning dress is kept and catalogued, and occasionally touched by white-gloved researchers who hold it up to the light and examine the construction. Someone will run a finger along a seam and feel the stitching, even and close and flat against the black. The work of hands that knew what they were doing, your hands, resting now, warm enough, the city breathing, sleep, good night,